My name is Fiona, and I am 33 years old. At our annual Christmas dinner, my grandmother handed my parents, my brother, and me each a check for $6 million. Everyone burst out laughing. My dad sneered, telling me it was fake and not to be an idiot. I watched my family tear their checks to shreds and toss them straight into the roaring fireplace. I quietly folded mine and tucked it away. The next morning at the bank, the branch manager's face went completely pale. He pulled me into his glass-walled office and whispered that we needed to talk. Before I reveal what happened next, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to survive a toxic family that constantly underestimated your worth. Growing up in the upscale suburbs of Chicago, I learned very quickly that love in our house was a strict transaction. You were either building the family legacy or you were an invisible disappointment. My father Howard and my mother Diane made those rules brutally clear from day one. Our sprawling estate with its manicured winter lawns and imposing brick facade was designed to project absolute perfection to the outside world. Inside it was an emotional freezer. Every holiday was an exhausting performance where we all had to play our assigned roles. The dining room table was set with my mother's finest crystal and silver, reflecting the warm light of the massive stone fireplace. The smell of roasted prime rib and expensive pine filled the air. It looked like a picture-perfect holiday gathering, but the emotional temperature in the room was suffocating. I sat quietly pushing food around my plate, observing the dynamic that had dictated my entire life. My 36-year-old brother Cameron sat at the head of the table right next to my father. Cameron was the undisputed golden child of the family. He was loud, arrogant, and completely reckless with money. While I had worked 3 jobs to pay my own way through a state college, Cameron had his private university tuition fully funded by our parents. When he failed his classes, they blamed his professors. When he crashed his brand new sports car, they blamed the weather. He had never faced a single consequence in his entire life. Currently, Cameron was dominating the conversation with his latest grand scheme. He leaned back in his heavy mahogany chair, swirling a glass of $200 Cabernet, and boasted about a new commercial real estate venture downtown. He threw around buzzwords like aggressive leverage and market disruption with the unearned confidence of a man playing with other people's money. He was detailing his plan to acquire a block of historic buildings and gut them for luxury condos. I knew for a fact that his last 3 real estate projects had barely broken, even leaving a trail of angry contractors and unpaid invoices. But in my parents' eyes, Cameron could simply do no wrong. My father Howard beamed at him with the kind of absolute pride I had spent my entire childhood chasing but never receiving. That is exactly the kind of aggressive expansion this family needs. Cameron, my father proclaimed, raising his glass in a toast. You have the vision to secure the legacy. Do not worry about the short-term capital requirements. I will happily bankroll the initial phases. We need to keep pushing forward and showing the city what we are made of. I sat there listening to my father promise hundreds of thousands of dollars to fund my brother's delusions. I had actually come to dinner tonight with my own good news. After years of grinding through the highly competitive tech industry, I had just been promoted to lead user experience designer at a major international software firm. It was a massive milestone. I had earned this role through grueling 60-hour work weeks, late-night coding sessions, and sheer unrelenting determination. I was managing a team of 20 developers and pulling in a salary that provided me with absolute financial independence. I was incredibly proud of myself. I waited for a rare lull in Cameron's endless monologue and gently cleared my throat, hoping to share my achievement. I just got my promotion finalized this week, I said, keeping my tone light but hopeful. I am officially the lead user experience designer for the new global platform launch. I am going to be running the entire digital architecture division. My mother Diane did not even look up from cutting her steak. That is nice, dear, she said with a dismissive wave of her perfectly manicured hand. But drawing buttons on a computer screen is hardly the same as acquiring real estate. Cameron is building tangible assets. He is building a real empire. You should really think about finding a wealthy husband who can provide for you instead of playing around with these little tech hobbies. The insult burned hot and sharp in my chest, but I was entirely used to it. Every single achievement of mine was systematically minimized to prop up my brother's fragile ego. If I won an industry award, it was deemed cute. If Cameron successfully tied his own shoes without tripping, it was declared a stroke of absolute genius. My fiancé Ian, who could not make the dinner due to a severe winter storm delay in Denver, had warned me not to expect validation from them. He always told me my worth was not determined by their inability to see it. He was a deeply supportive partner, and he was entirely right. But it still stung to sit at your own family table and feel completely invisible. I took a slow sip of water, refusing to let them see my frustration. I reminded myself that I did not need their money or their approval to survive. I had built my own life brick by brick. But the blatant disrespect still hung heavy in the air, settling over the table like toxic dust. Sitting at the far end of the long table was my grandmother Beatrice. She was 82 years old and wearing a simple pearl necklace over a sharp gray wool cardigan. My parents treated her like a senile burden, a nuisance they simply had to tolerate during the holidays for the sake of appearances. They constantly spoke over her, rolled their eyes when she told stories from her youth, and assumed her mind was completely gone. Because her physical movements had slowed, they wrongly concluded that her mental acuity had faded as well. They thought she was just a frail old woman slowly fading away into the background of their vibrant, successful lives. They were monumentally wrong. Beatrice had been completely silent throughout the entire meal. She sat with her back straight, watching the toxic dynamic play out with a piercing, calculating gaze that missed absolutely nothing. She had seen my father blindly hand over his wealth to a fool. She had seen my mother cruelly dismiss my hard-earned success. She had absorbed every ounce of arrogance radiating from Cameron. Suddenly, Beatrice picked up her heavy silver spoon and tapped it sharply against her crystal water glass. The sharp, ringing sound cut cleanly through Cameron's endless boasting about zoning laws and municipal permits. The entire table fell silent in shock. My grandmother rarely spoke up during these dinners, preferring to observe from the sidelines. My father looked profoundly annoyed by the sudden interruption. He let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, treating his own mother like a misbehaving toddler. "What is it, Mother?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Do you need someone to help you find the bathroom again? Are you confused about what day it is?" Beatrice completely ignored his blatant disrespect. She sat up perfectly straight, her eyes clear, sharp, and intensely focused. She reached down into her structured leather handbag resting by her feet. We all watched in confused silence as she slowly pulled out 4 thick, sealed envelopes. The paper was premium heavy stock bearing the embossed logo of a highly exclusive private wealth management firm. She passed them silently down the heavy mahogany table. She handed one to my father, one to my mother, one to Cameron, and finally the last one to me. I held the crisp envelope in my hands, noting my name written across the front in her elegant, remarkably steady cursive handwriting. "I have been listening to you all talk about legacy and wealth and power all evening," Beatrice said, her voice remarkably steady, cold, and commanding. "I have listened to you boast about your investments. I have watched how you treat each other. I have decided it is time to distribute my liquid assets. I am not getting any younger, and I want to see exactly how you handle your inheritances while I am still here to witness it with my own 2 eyes." My brother snorted loudly, clearly amused by the idea of this frail old woman giving us anything of substantial value. He assumed she was handing out $50 savings bonds, or perhaps a few shares of ancient stock she had held onto for decades. He casually ripped open his envelope, tearing the heavy paper with careless force, expecting a minor holiday tip. I opened mine, carefully sliding my finger under the flap to preserve the envelope. Inside was a standard bank check, but the numbers printed across the center box made my breath catch violently in my throat. I blinked hard, sure my eyes were playing tricks on me in the dim lighting of the dining room. I read the zeros again, counting them one by one to make sure I was not hallucinating. It was a check made out directly to me for exactly $6 million. I looked up, my heart pounding wildly against my ribs. I glanced across the table,
Cameron was staring at his piece of paper, his arrogant smirk frozen in place. My father had gone completely silent, his mouth slightly open as he processed the astronomical number printed before him. My mother simply stared at the check in her hands, looking as though the air had been entirely knocked out of her lungs.
$6 million each. $24 million sitting casually on the dining room table next to the cranberry sauce and the dinner rolls. The sheer magnitude of the wealth Beatrice had just casually dropped into our laps was paralyzing. No one spoke. The only sound in the massive room was the crackle and pop of the burning logs in the fireplace. We were all holding small pieces of paper that had the power to instantly change the trajectory of our entire lives. The heavy silence holding the room hostage shattered the moment Cameron threw his head back and let out a booming theatrical laugh. It was a harsh, grating sound that bounced off the vaulted ceiling and completely destroyed whatever fragile piece remained at the dinner table. He picked up the piece of paper, holding it between his thumb and index finger as if it were a dirty napkin. He waved the check in the air like a cheap novelty prop purchased from a joke shop. He was thoroughly amused by his own cruelty. "Oh, this is priceless," Cameron chuckled, his face turning red from his own perceived hilarity. He slapped his hand against the mahogany table, making the crystal wine glasses rattle. $6 million. Really, Grandma? I knew you were getting a little forgetful lately, but I did not realize you had completely lost your grip on reality. Did you print these out from the internet? Or did you find a magical checkbook in the attic? I sat frozen, watching the ugly scene unfold. The disrespect was so casual, so ingrained in his personality, that he did not even hesitate to humiliate an 82-year-old woman in front of her entire family. I looked over at Beatrice, expecting to see hurt or confusion in her eyes. Instead, she sat perfectly still, her expression an unreadable mask of cold composure. She did not flinch. She did not defend herself. She simply watched him with the quiet intensity of a predator studying its prey. My father Howard let out a heavy sigh, rubbing the bridge of his nose, as if dealing with us was the greatest burden a man could bear. He reached over and snatched the check from Cameron's hand, examining it for a brief second before tossing it back onto the table with absolute disgust. He shook his head and looked at my mother, communicating a silent shared agreement that Beatrice had finally crossed the line from elderly eccentricity into full-blown dementia. Howard turned his sharp gaze toward me, catching the look of shock on my face. He pointed a thick finger in my direction, his voice dripping with his usual condescension. "Wipe that look off your face, Fiona," he snapped. "It is fake. Do not be an idiot. Your grandmother does not even know what year it is, let alone have $24 million sitting in a checking account. She has been living off my generosity for the last decade. This is just another one of her confused episodes. Do not humor her by pretending it is real." The sheer audacity of his statement made my blood boil. Beatrice had never lived off my father's generosity. She owned her own modest home on the other side of the city and lived quietly on her own terms. But in Howard's mind, anyone who did not actively generate massive corporate wealth was essentially a dependent. He had always viewed his own mother as a financial and social liability. Cameron leaned back in his chair, clearly feeling empowered by our father's validation. He picked up his check again, this time with a dangerous gleam in his eye. "You know what we do with fake money?" he asked, looking around the table like a ringmaster demanding the attention of his audience. "We get rid of it before it clutters up the house." To prove his point, Cameron dramatically gripped the edges of the heavy paper. With a loud, exaggerated tearing sound, he ripped the $6 million check right down the middle. He held up the two halves, making sure everyone was watching him. Then he placed them together and tore them again. He reduced the crisp document into useless, jagged quarters. He stood up from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor, and walked over to the massive stone fireplace. The fire was roaring, sending waves of heat into the dining room. Cameron stood before the flames, his silhouette casting a long, dark shadow over the holiday decorations. He tossed the torn scraps of paper directly into the fire. We all watched as the edges curled, blackened, and burst into bright orange flames. Within seconds, the check was reduced to nothing but gray ash floating up the chimney. Cameron dusted his hands together with a satisfied smirk, as if he had just performed a great public service. Howard watched his son with a look of deep approval. Not wanting to be outdone in his own home, my father picked up his envelope. He did not even bother opening it to look at the check inside. He simply ripped the entire envelope in half, applying brute force to demonstrate his absolute authority over the situation. He stood up, joined his golden boy at the fireplace, and tossed his pieces into the blazing inferno. "There," Howard said, returning to his seat and picking up his wineglass. "Now that the nonsense is out of the way, we can get back to discussing real business. Cameron, remind me about the zoning permits for your downtown project. I want to make sure my capital is being deployed efficiently." The casual destruction of the checks was sickening. Even if they firmly believed the money was entirely fake, tearing up a gift right in front of the person who gave it was a level of cruelty that I could hardly process. I looked over at my mother Diane, expecting her to at least offer a polite mediation to smooth over the social awkwardness. Instead, Diane let out an exasperated sigh, picking up her crystal wineglass with an elegant flick of her wrist. She rolled her eyes toward the ceiling, clearly annoyed that the focus of the evening had temporarily shifted away from their wealth and status. She did not tear her check up, but she treated it with equal disdain. She simply pushed the unopened envelope away from her plate, abandoning it next to her wineglass like a piece of discarded trash. She smoothed her napkin over her lap and turned her attention back to her prime rib, completely ignoring the fact that her mother-in-law was sitting just 3 feet away. "Well, that was certainly a bizarre interruption," Diane murmured, taking a delicate sip of her wine. "As I was saying before, we need to finalize the guest list for the spring gala. I absolutely refuse to seat the mayor next to that awful developer from the west side." The conversation instantly shifted back to their shallow, high society concerns. It was as if the incident with Beatrice had never happened. They had collectively decided to erase her from the narrative of the evening. I sat there gripping my own envelope, my knuckles turning white. The anger inside me was a living, breathing thing, threatening to spill over. I wanted to scream at them. I wanted to flip the table and demand they show a shred of human decency to my grandmother. But years of surviving in this house had taught me that reacting emotionally only gave them ammunition. If I raised my voice, my father would call me hysterical. If I defended Beatrice, my mother would accuse me of being overly dramatic. They would use my empathy as proof that I was weak and unsuited for their cutthroat world. Cameron noticed me staring at the envelope in my hands. He nudged my father and pointed at me, laughing under his breath. "Look at her, Dad. She is still holding on to it. I think the little designer actually believes she just became a millionaire." Howard let out a short, dismissive scoff. "Fiona, put that garbage away. You are embarrassing yourself. If you want to make real money, you need to stop playing on your computer and learn how the real world works. You are 33 years old. It is time to stop believing in fairy tales." Diane chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial pity. "Just let her keep it, Howard. It is probably the closest she will ever get to seeing a $6 million check. It makes a nice souvenir for her little apartment." Their relentless mockery echoed in my ears, but I forced myself to remain completely still. I looked at Beatrice again. Her eyes met mine down the length of the long table. There was no sadness in her gaze. Instead, there was a silent, commanding intensity, a look that told me to hold my ground. I did not believe for a single second that the check was real. I knew Beatrice lived a modest life, and the idea of her possessing $24 million was logically impossible. But the reality of the money was entirely irrelevant to me in that moment. What mattered was dignity. What mattered was refusing to participate in their grotesque display of arrogance. "I will not throw it in the fire," I said, my voice low, but perfectly steady. Cameron rolled his eyes, pouring himself another glass of wine. "Suit yourself, loser, but do not try to cash it at your local credit union. They might lock you up for fraud." I ignored his taunt. I slowly folded the crisp paper, ensuring the edges met perfectly. I opened my leather purse resting on the chair beside me and slipped the check safely into the interior zip pocket. I zipped it shut with a definitive click. I did this not out of any delusional hope of sudden immense wealth, but out of basic human respect for my grandmother. She had handed me a gift, and I was going to treat it like one, even if my entire family thought it was a joke. The rest of the Christmas dinner passed in a blur of clinking silver and empty, arrogant chatter. Cameron continued to outline his doomed real estate empire, while Howard nodded along, funding the disaster with his own massive ego. Diane complained about her social rivals and the incompetent staff at the country club. I ate the remainder of my food in total silence, contributing absolutely nothing to the conversation. I was simply counting the minutes until I could politely excuse myself and return to the peace of my own home, where my supportive fiancé Ian was waiting for my call. When the dinner finally concluded, I stood up and walked over to Beatrice. I leaned down and gently kissed her soft, wrinkled cheek. The scent of her classic lavender perfume was a sharp contrast to the suffocating arrogance of the room. "Thank you for the gift, Grandma," I whispered softly so the others would not hear. "I appreciate it." Beatrice patted my hand, her skin cool and dry. Her dark eyes locked onto mine, and for a brief second, I saw a flash of something incredibly sharp and dangerous lurking just beneath the surface of her calm exterior. "Keep it safe, Fiona," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "You are going to need it sooner than you think." I smiled politely, assuming it was just the sweet rambling of an old woman trying to maintain her dignity after a brutal public humiliation. I told my parents goodbye, ignoring their cold, dismissive nods, and walked out the heavy front doors into the freezing Chicago night. The bitter wind whipped around me, pulling the heat from my skin, but it felt infinitely better than the toxic atmosphere inside that house. I got into my car, turning the heater on high, and drove back to the city, my purse resting on the passenger seat beside me. I had completely forgotten about the folded piece of paper inside. It convinced the night was just another painful chapter in my family's long history of cruelty. I had absolutely no idea that the piece of paper in my purse was a loaded weapon waiting to be fired. The morning light filtering through my apartment windows was a harsh, icy gray. I woke up to the sound of my alarm buzzing, pulling me out of a restless sleep filled with disjointed dreams about burning paper and my brother's mocking laughter. The events of Christmas dinner still sat heavy in my chest, a toxic reminder of why I usually limited my visits home. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a cup of black coffee, trying to shake the residual tension. Ian, my fiancé, had texted me late last night after his flight finally landed in Denver. He called me shortly after I woke up, his voice warm and grounding. I told him exactly what had happened at the dinner table. I described the arrogance, the casual cruelty, and the bizarre, dramatic tearing of the checks. Ian listened patiently, never interrupting. When I finished, he let out a heavy breath, expressing his utter disbelief at their behavior. He told me I was incredibly strong for maintaining my composure and reminded me that we had our own life to focus on. A life built on mutual respect and actual achievements. I agreed with him wholeheartedly. But as we hung up, my eyes drifted to my leather purse sitting on the kitchen counter. The folded piece of paper was still inside the zip pocket. I knew it was a fake. It had to be. My grandmother lived a modest life in a modest house and drove a 10-year-old sedan. The idea of her casually handing out $24 million was mathematically and logically impossible. Yet a tiny nagging voice in the back of my head refused to let it go. It was the same voice that drove me to obsessively test my digital designs for unseen errors. I needed closure. I needed a bank teller to hand the paper back to me with a sympathetic smile and confirm it was just a novelty item. Only then could I throw it away and permanently close the book on my family's holiday madness. I dressed for work, putting on a sharp navy blazer and tailored trousers, projecting the professional confidence I needed for my new role as lead user experience designer. I grabbed my purse and headed out into the freezing Chicago morning. My office was located downtown, but I decided to stop at my local bank branch on the way. It was a Tuesday, and the bank had just opened its doors.
The interior was quiet, smelling faintly of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. I walked up to the counter where a young teller with a cheerful name tag reading Sarah greeted me. She asked how she could help me today. I pulled the folded check from my purse and smoothed out the crease down the middle. I slid it across the polished marble counter. "I would like to deposit this," I said, keeping my voice entirely casual. "I am fairly certain it is a joke gift from a relative, but I just wanted to verify it before I throw it away." Sarah smiled politely and picked up the piece of heavy paper. She did not even look at the numbers at first, simply flipping it over to check for my endorsement. "Please sign the back," she requested, sliding a pen across the counter. I signed my name, feeling slightly foolish for taking up her time. I handed it back. Sarah took the check and glanced down at the front to key the amount into her computer. I watched the exact moment her brain processed the number written in my grandmother's steady cursive. Her fingers froze, hovering over the keyboard. Her polite customer service smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. She blinked hard, bringing the check closer to her face as if inspecting the watermarks. Her eyes darted from the paper to the computer screen, and then back to the paper. "Is there a problem?" I asked, preparing to laugh it off and take the fake check back. Sarah did not answer me. Her breathing had become noticeably shallow. She picked up a small scanning device and ran the check through the machine, the scanner whirred, pulling the heavy stock paper through its rollers. A loud automated beep echoed from her terminal. The screen flashed a solid, bright red color. Sarah gasped softly and hit a button on her keyboard, causing her entire monitor to lock immediately. "Ma'am, I am going to need you to wait right here," Sarah stammered, her voice trembling. She did not make eye contact with me. She turned around and practically jogged toward the back offices, clutching the piece of paper to her chest like it was a live explosive. I stood at the counter, feeling a sudden spike of anxiety. My brother Cameron had joked that the bank might arrest me for fraud if I tried to cash it. For a terrifying second, I wondered if my family had set me up. What if this was some elaborate, cruel prank designed to get me in legal trouble? My heart began to hammer against my ribs. I looked around the quiet lobby, half expecting security guards to come marching toward me. Instead, the heavy wooden door of the back office opened, and the branch manager stepped out. I recognized him from previous visits to set up my business accounts. His name was Mr. Harrison. He was a seasoned banker in his late 50s, usually exuding an air of bored professional calm. Today, however, Mr. Harrison looked completely different. He was holding my grandmother's check, and his face was entirely pale. He walked toward my teller station with quick, urgent strides, completely ignoring the other customers in the lobby. "Miss Fiona," he said, his voice tight with suppressed tension, "could you please step into my office right now?" It was not a request. He gestured toward a large glass-walled office at the corner of the building. I nodded, swallowing hard, and followed him. As I walked past the teller station, I noticed Sarah watching me with wide, terrified eyes. I stepped into the office, and Mr. Harrison closed the door firmly behind us, shutting out the ambient noise of the bank lobby. He moved to the electronic blinds, pressing a button that caused the frosted panels to slide shut, completely blocking us from the view of anyone outside. "Please sit down," he instructed, gesturing to a leather chair across from his massive desk. I sat, my hands gripping the armrests. "Look, I know it is a fake," I started, rushing to explain myself. "My grandmother gave it to me at Christmas dinner. My whole family thought it was a joke. I just wanted to confirm it before I threw it away. I swear I am not trying to commit fraud." Mr. Harrison held up his hand, stopping my frantic explanation. He sat down heavily in his chair, placing the check carefully on the pristine surface of his desk. He stared at it for a long moment before finally looking up at me. He leaned across the desk, closing the distance between us, and lowered his voice to a hushed, urgent whisper. "Mom, we need to talk," he said. I braced myself for a lecture on bank policy or a threat to call the police. I took a deep breath, ready to defend myself. "This check is not a fake," he whispered. His eyes locked onto mine. I stared at him, my brain completely rejecting the words he had just spoken. "Excuse me," I asked, sure I had misheard him. Mr. Harrison picked up a secure tablet from his desk. He tapped the screen several times, pulling up a highly restricted banking interface that I had never seen before. When Sarah scanned the routing numbers on this document, it triggered an automatic security lockdown on her terminal. He explained, his voice still incredibly low. That happens when a branch-level employee attempts to process a transaction linked to a Tier 1 private wealth management account. "I do not understand what that means," I replied, my voice shaking. "It means," he continued, tapping the screen again, "that this check is drawn from an account so exclusive and so heavily fortified that my local tellers do not even have the security clearance to view the balance." I had to use my executive override to contact the Central Wealth Management Division in New York directly to verify the routing numbers and the signature. He turned the tablet slightly so I could see the screen. It was displaying a secure communication log with a high-level banking executive. "I just got off the phone with their lead verification officer," Mr. Harrison said, taking a deep breath. "They confirmed the account belongs to Beatrice. They verified the signature matches her authorized biometric records, and they confirmed the funds." He paused, looking at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. "The funds are there, Fiona. Every single cent. The check is completely real." The air vanished from the room. My ears began to ring with a high-pitched whine. I gripped the leather armrests of the chair so hard my fingers ached. I tried to speak, but my throat was completely dry. "You mean to tell me," I choked out, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else, "that my grandmother actually has $6 million? Mr. Harrison let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "Mom, an account of this tier requires a minimum standing balance of $50 million just to open it. I have no idea how much wealth your grandmother actually possesses, but I can guarantee you it is staggering. And right now I have direct authorization from New York to clear this transaction immediately." He typed a final sequence of numbers into his secure tablet. He hit the enter button with a definitive click. I watched his screen load. A bright green confirmation banner appeared across the interface. Mr. Harrison looked up at me, the color slowly returning to his face. "The funds have officially cleared," he announced, his voice returning to a normal volume. "The money has been transferred entirely into your primary account. I am going to need to upgrade your account status to our private wealth division immediately to handle a deposit of this magnitude, but it is done." I sat paralyzed in the leather chair. The reality of the situation crashed over me like a tidal wave. $6 million. It was sitting in my account. It was mine. My grandmother, the woman my parents and brother treated like a senile, helpless burden, was secretly sitting on an empire of staggering wealth. And then the second realization hit me, striking with the force of a physical blow. The fireplace, the mocking laughter, the arrogant tearing of heavy paper. My father and my brother had each held $6 million in their hands. They had burned $12 million to ashes simply to prove a cruel point. My mother had abandoned her $6 million next to a wine glass out of sheer spite. They had literally destroyed their own salvation out of pure, unadulterated arrogance. I was the only one who had kept the check. I was the only one who had shown Beatrice an ounce of basic respect. And because of that, I had just walked into a bank branch on a freezing Tuesday morning and walked out a multi-millionaire. The loaded weapon in my purse had just been fired, and it was going to change absolutely everything. The loaded weapon in my purse had just been fired, and it was going to change absolutely everything. I walked out of the bank in a complete daze. The bitter Chicago wind hit my face, but I barely felt the cold. I drove straight home and sat on my sofa staring at my updated banking app. The numbers on the screen were indisputable: $6 million. I spent the next 3 days in a state of suspended animation. I went to work, I talked to Ian, and I kept the monumental secret locked tightly inside my chest. Ian noticed my distraction, but he simply held me close, assuring me that whatever was going on, we would handle it together. I did not call my parents to brag. I did not call my brother to gloat. I simply waited in the quiet sanctuary of my apartment to see what would happen next. The answer came exactly 3 days after our disastrous Christmas dinner. It was early Thursday morning when my phone buzzed on the nightstand.
The caller ID flashed with my father's name. Howard rarely called me directly unless he needed to issue a command or express a disappointment. I answered with a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. "Your grandmother died last night," Howard stated. His voice was entirely flat, devoid of any recognizable human emotion. "She passed away in her sleep. The housekeeper found her this morning. We are hosting the funeral arrangements at the house today. Be here by noon. Do not wear that cheap gray coat you wore at Thanksgiving." He hung up before I could even process the words. Beatrice was gone. The shock hit me with a delayed physical force. My grandmother, the woman who had just silently handed out $24 million and watched her family burn it to ashes, had passed away peacefully in her sleep. A profound wave of genuine grief washed over me. She had been the only person in that family who possessed an ounce of integrity. I sat on the edge of my bed and let the tears fall, grieving the fierce, quiet woman who had used her final days to teach us all a lesson. When I arrived at my parents' estate at exactly noon, the atmosphere was sickening. The driveway was already packed with luxury vehicles belonging to event coordinators and catering companies. There was no quiet mourning. There were no hushed tones of respectful remembrance. There were no framed photos of Beatrice celebrating her long and vibrant life. Instead, the house buzzed with the frenetic energy of a high society event planner preparing for a major gala. My mother Diane was standing in the grand foyer barking orders at a team of florists. She was already dressed in a tailored black designer dress that looked like it belonged on a fashion runway rather than at a memorial service. "I said white lilies," Diane snapped, pointing a manicured finger at a terrified florist holding a massive arrangement. "These have a yellow undertone. They will clash horribly with the upholstery at the country club reception. Fix it immediately. The mayor is attending, and I will not have this family looking like we purchase our floral arrangements from a discount grocery store." She spotted me walking through the front door and let out a dramatic sigh as if my mere presence was an unbearable inconvenience. "Fiona, finally," she huffed, adjusting a diamond brooch on her collar. "Go to the dining room and help the caterers sort out the seating chart. I have placed the city council members at table 4, but I need to make sure they are seated next to the zoning commissioner. This funeral is the perfect opportunity to push through Cameron's permits while everyone is feeling sympathetic. Do not mess up the name cards like you did at the charity dinner last year." The sheer hypocrisy made my stomach turn. Beatrice had not even been gone for 24 hours, and Diane was already weaponizing her death for political and social leverage. My mother was treating the funeral like an exclusive networking event. She was compiling a guest list designed to maximize her social standing, ensuring that the wealthiest and most influential members of the Chicago elite would witness her performative grief. I walked past her without saying a word. The house was filled with strangers coordinating an extravagant spectacle for a woman they did not know and frankly did not care about. Beatrice had despised these types of flashy displays. She had lived a quiet life, preferring the company of a good book and a cup of tea over a room full of arrogant socialites trying to outdress one another. But Diane was determined to wring every drop of social currency out of her mother-in-law's, turning a moment of grief into a highly calculated networking event. I made my way down the long hallway toward the dining room, but stopped when I heard voices coming from my father's private study. The heavy oak door was left slightly ajar. I stood in the shadows of the corridor holding my breath and listened. Cameron was pacing frantically back and forth across the Persian rug. The arrogant swagger he had displayed at Christmas dinner was entirely gone. He sounded desperate, his voice pitching higher than usual. "The creditors are breathing down my neck, Dad," Cameron said, his footsteps thudding against the hardwood floor. "They are threatening to pull the bridge loan by Friday. If they do that, the entire downtown project collapses. The holding company will fold, and I will be personally liable for the deficit. I need cash immediately. I cannot wait for a protracted probate process." I heard the distinct sound of liquid being poured into a crystal tumbler. My father spoke, his tone calm and calculating. "Relax, Cameron. You are panicking over nothing. Beatrice dying right now is actually the best thing that could have happened for your timeline. The timing is a literal godsend. I pressed myself flat against the wall, feeling a fresh wave of disgust. My father was openly referring to his own mother's death as a convenient financial bailout. We both know she had the standard family trust set up, Howard continued, ice clinking in his glass. Even with her modest lifestyle, she has the house in Oak Park, the retirement accounts, and whatever cash she hoarded away over the last decade. It has to be worth at least 4 or 5 million in liquid assets. As her only son, I am the primary executor. I can authorize an emergency disbursement to your LLC the minute the death certificate is filed. We will use the estate as collateral to stall your creditors by tomorrow afternoon. Cameron let out a long, shaky breath of profound relief. The sound of his exhale was loud enough to echo into the hallway. Thank God. Seriously, Dad, she finally did something useful for this family. I was looking at total bankruptcy. The bank was threatening to seize my personal assets by the end of the month. Do you think there is any chance she left a portion to Fiona? I know she always had a soft spot for her. Howard scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound that made my chest tighten with familiar resentment. Absolutely not. Beatrice knew Fiona is a lost cause. She would not waste real capital on a girl who draws shapes on a computer for a living. Fiona does not have the stomach for real wealth anyway. The estate will be divided between you and me exactly as it should be. We will inject the capital directly into your real estate firm, secure the family legacy, and move on. This is exactly what we needed to get over the hump and silence those pathetic investors. I stood outside the study door listening to them carve up an inheritance they firmly believed was waiting for them. The arrogance was blinding. They were completely convinced that Beatrice had lived a standard upper-middle-class existence and had left a predictable conventional will. They thought her entire net worth amounted to a few $1,000,000 tied up in a suburban house and some mutual funds. They had absolutely no idea that the real wealth, the staggering astronomical fortune she possessed, had already been distributed. They had no idea that they had literally held their salvation in their hands just 3 nights ago. They had mocked her, called her senile, and thrown $6 million into a blazing fire out of pure, unadulterated ego. And most importantly, they had absolutely no idea that I was standing in the hallway holding the only surviving piece of that fortune. I quietly backed away from the study door, my heart pounding with a mixture of grief and mounting anticipation. Let them plan, I thought to myself. Let them make their promises to their creditors. Let Diane order her expensive white lilies and invite the mayor. Let them put on their grotesque theatrical display of mourning for the entire city to see. They were building a house of cards on a foundation of pure greed. They were treating Beatrice's passing as a lucky financial break, a convenient solution to Cameron's gross incompetence. They felt so powerful, so secure in their position at the top of the family hierarchy. I walked into the dining room to help the caterers, just as Diane had commanded. I sorted the seating charts, placing the city council members exactly where my mother wanted them. I played the role of the quiet, obedient scapegoat perfectly. I kept my face blank and my voice low, enduring their sharp commands and dismissive waves throughout the entire afternoon. I knew the reading of the will was scheduled for the day after the funeral at the downtown office of her attorney. I knew that they were walking blindly toward an absolute cliff. The $24 million was gone. The liquid estate they were counting on to save Cameron from total ruin had been burned to ashes by their own hands. I just had to wait for gravity to take over. The day after the funeral arrived with a bitter, biting chill that swept off Lake Michigan and rattled the heavy glass windows of the downtown financial district. I rode the elevator up to the 42nd floor of one of Chicago's most prestigious law firms, keeping my hands neatly folded in the pockets of my dark wool coat. I stepped into the sprawling reception area of Bradley and Associates. The office was an intimidating display of old money and corporate power, featuring dark mahogany-paneled walls, leather seating, and sweeping panoramic views of the city skyline. It was exactly the kind of environment my father Howard respected. To him, leather and mahogany signaled submission and compliance. My parents and my brother were already waiting in the private conference room when I was escorted inside. The atmosphere was thick with palpable, restless greed. There was not a single trace of mourning in the room. No one was dabbing their eyes with tissues or sharing fond memories of Beatrice.
Instead, the energy mirrored the frantic anticipation of lottery winners waiting to claim a massive jackpot.
Cameron was pacing the length of the long, polished conference table. He was dressed in a tailored suit that he absolutely could not afford, aggressively tapping away on his smartphone. I watched him fire off message after message. He was undoubtedly texting his furious creditors and the anxious investors of his failing real estate venture. I could easily imagine the promises he was making. He was likely assuring them that a massive influx of liquid capital was mere minutes away, guaranteeing that the family estate would cover all his outstanding debts and fraudulent bridge loans. His arrogant swagger had fully returned, fueled by the absolute certainty of his impending wealth. Howard sat at the head of the table, naturally claiming the position of absolute authority. He was reviewing some spreadsheets on his tablet, periodically checking his heavy gold watch with obvious annoyance. He wanted the asset transfer completed immediately so he could deploy the capital to salvage his son's disastrous business choices. Diane was seated next to him, complaining to a paralegal about the temperature of the room and the quality of the espresso she had been served. She was treating the legal staff like her personal catering team, completely oblivious to the solemn nature of a will reading. I took a seat at the far end of the table, placing my purse carefully on the floor beside my feet. I remained entirely silent, offering no greetings and responding to no complaints. I simply watched the three of them operate in their bubble of supreme entitlement. They were so spectacularly confident. They had already spent the money in their minds. The heavy door to the conference room opened and Bradley walked in. He was a sharp, no-nonsense estate attorney in his late 60s. He had represented Beatrice for over 2 decades. He wore a crisp gray suit and carried a single surprisingly thin manila folder. Bradley possessed a cold, calculating intelligence. He knew my grandmother perfectly, and more importantly, he understood exactly how toxic my father and brother were. He did not offer any fake pleasantries or empty condolences as he took his seat at the opposite end of the table. "Let us get straight to business, Bradley," Howard commanded, leaning forward and folding his hands on the polished wood. "We have a lot of moving parts to manage today. Cameron has a major commercial acquisition downtown that requires immediate capitalization. I need the liquid assets transferred to my primary holding accounts by the end of business today so I can authorize the disbursements. Skip the formalities and just give us the final numbers." Bradley did not flinch at my father's demanding tone. He calmly adjusted his silver-framed glasses and opened the thin manila folder. He looked at Howard with a completely blank expression devoid of any professional deference. Howard frowned, looking at the single piece of paper resting inside the folder. "Is that the summary? Where is the rest of the documentation?" "My mother's estate should require a comprehensive portfolio. She owned the Oak Park property, the retirement accounts, and the mutual funds. I need the full itemized ledger." "There is no itemized ledger for liquid assets," Howard Bradley replied, his voice smooth and incredibly dry. "Your mother updated her last will and testament precisely 5 days before her passing. She simplified her estate considerably. I will now read the final directive regarding her liquid capital." Cameron stopped pacing and leaned against the glass wall, crossing his arms with a smug, triumphant smile. He was ready for his bailout. Diane paused her complaints and leaned in, eager to hear the exact dollar amount that would elevate her social standing. Bradley cleared his throat and looked directly at my father. He read the exceptionally brief document aloud, ensuring every single syllable carried its full weight. "To my son, daughter-in-law, and grandchildren, I distributed the entirety of my liquid estate to you on Christmas Day. Whatever you chose to do with your inheritance is your own burden to bear." Bradley closed the manila folder with a soft, definitive snap. He folded his hands precisely over the closed file. "That concludes the reading of the liquid estate distribution," he announced. For 10 agonizing seconds, the room went completely dead. The silence was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. The words hung in the air, floating above the mahogany table like a toxic gas. The gears in their heads were grinding desperately, trying to process the information. "What the hell does that mean?" Cameron barked, pushing himself off the glass wall. His arrogant smile had vanished, replaced by a deep, angry confusion. "Distributed on Christmas Day. She gave us fake checks on Christmas Day. It was a senile joke. Stop playing games and read the actual numbers. Bradley looked at Cameron with an expression of pure icy pity. They were not fake checks, Cameron. They were drawn directly from a Tier 1 private wealth management account. Your grandmother possessed a highly diverse portfolio that I have personally managed for 20 years. The checks she physically handed to each of you represented the absolute entirety of her liquid fortune. Howard's face drained of all color. The ruddy, arrogant flush in his cheeks vanished instantly, leaving his skin a sickly, grayish white. He gripped the edge of the conference table so hard his knuckles popped. He stared at Bradley, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. He was a man who prided himself on absolute control, and he was entirely paralyzed by the realization crashing down upon him. Diane suddenly let out a sharp, gasping breath. Her hands flew to her mouth, her perfectly manicured nails pressing into her cheeks. "My God," she whispered, her voice trembling with rising panic. "The envelope." I left the envelope next to my wine glass. "The cleaning staff." I told the cleaning staff to throw away all the table scraps the next morning. It went into the trash. Cameron looked like he had been physically struck in the chest by a sledgehammer. He stumbled backward, hitting the glass wall behind him. His eyes were wide and frantic, darting around the room as his brain finally connected the horrifying dots. He looked at the floor, then at his hands, then at my father. The fire, Cameron choked out, his voice sounding small and completely broken. "The fireplace. Dad, we threw them in the fire. We tore them up and threw them in the fire." The reality of their actions descended upon the room with crushing, devastating force. They had not just lost an inheritance, they had actively, physically destroyed it with their own hands. They had burned their salvation to ashes out of pure spite and monumental arrogance. Howard suddenly shot up from his chair, knocking it backward onto the thick carpet. "No!" he roared, slamming his fists onto the table. "No! That is impossible. My mother did not have that kind of money. She lived in a basic house. She drove an old car. You are lying. This is a mistake." "It is not a mistake," Howard Bradley replied, his voice remaining entirely calm and unaffected by my father's outburst. "Your mother was a brilliant silent investor. She preferred a modest lifestyle, but her market instincts were unparalleled. The checks she gave you were entirely real." "How much?" Cameron yelled, taking a threatening step toward the attorney. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving under his expensive suit. His eyes were completely wild with desperation. How much was on those checks? I did not even look at the numbers. How much did we burn? Bradley adjusted his glasses and looked at Cameron dead in the eye. "Exactly $24 million, $6 million per person, which, as Beatrice explicitly instructed, was physically handed to each of you in perfect legal compliance with her distribution wishes. You were given your inheritance. The fact that you chose to incinerate it is, as the will states, entirely your own burden to bear." Cameron let out a sound that was half scream and half sob. He grabbed his own hair, pulling at the roots as his legs gave out beneath him. He collapsed into one of the leather chairs, burying his face in his hands. He was ruined. The investors would tear him apart. The creditors would seize his properties. He had just burned $6 million of pure, untethered salvation. Howard stood frozen, hovering over the table. The great patriarch, the brilliant businessman, had just incinerated a fortune because he wanted to mock an elderly woman. The absolute humiliation and financial devastation radiated from him in waves. Diane was openly weeping now, her face buried in her expensive handbag, grieving the loss of money she had treated like garbage just days prior. I sat quietly at the end of the table, my hands resting neatly in my lap. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply watched the structural foundation of my toxic family collapse under the weight of their own spectacular hubris. The $24 million was gone. The grand bailout was a pile of gray ash sitting at the bottom of a chimney in the suburbs. And I was the only person in the room who knew exactly where one surviving piece of that fortune currently resided. Cameron was the first to break the suffocating silence. He launched himself out of the leather chair, his hands slamming down flat against the polished mahogany table. The sudden violent movement rattled the water pitchers. He leaned aggressively toward Bradley, his face contorted into a mask of pure desperation. "Reprint them!" Cameron demanded, his voice cracking with a frantic, breathless panic. "You are her attorney. You have the routing numbers. You manage the estate. Just print a new set of checks right now. We will sign whatever waivers you need. Just cut the paper, Bradley." Bradley did not even blink. He looked at Cameron with the detached fascination of a scientist observing an insect. "I cannot do that, Cameron. I do not have the authority to print new checks, nor do I have access to those specific funds. The physical checks your grandmother handed you were the sole legal instruments of transfer. They were bearer instruments drawn from a closed account. Once you destroyed them, you destroyed your only means of accessing the capital." "This is absurd!" Diane shrieked. She shot up from her chair, her tear-stained face twisting into a venomous scowl. The performative grief she had worn to the funeral was entirely gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated avarice. My mother-in-law was a sick, confused old woman. She was 82 years old and completely out of her mind. You cannot legally enforce a distribution of this magnitude when the benefactor was suffering from severe cognitive decline. We will take this to probate court. We will have the entire distribution annulled based on mental incompetence. You are committing malpractice by even entertaining this." Bradley did not raise his voice. He simply reached into his remarkably thin manila folder and pulled out 3 stapled packets of paper. He slid them smoothly across the long table, stopping exactly in front of my father. "I anticipated this exact reaction," Diane Bradley stated, his tone devoid of any sympathy. "And more importantly, Beatrice anticipated it. She knew you would immediately attempt to declare her incompetent the moment her financial decisions did not favor you. Please review those documents, Howard." My father picked up the packets with trembling hands. His eyes darted back and forth across the pages. "Those are 3 independent psychiatric evaluations," Bradley explained, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers. "They were conducted on December 18th, 19th, and 20th. 3 different board-certified specialists, completely unaffiliated with one another, spent several hours examining your mother. They administered rigorous cognitive testing. All 3 doctors signed sworn affidavits declaring that Beatrice possessed a level of mental acuity sharper than most people half her age. She was legally, medically, and unequivocally of sound mind. Any judge in the state of Illinois will laugh you out of the courtroom if you attempt to challenge her competency." Howard dropped the papers onto the table as if they had burned his fingers. The fight completely drained out of him. The patriarch of the family, the man who controlled every narrative and dictated every financial move, was entirely paralyzed by the brilliance of his own mother's trap. Cameron, however, refused to accept defeat. His breathing was ragged, his chest heaving under his tailored suit. The arrogant real estate developer was disintegrating before my eyes, reduced to a terrified man facing absolute financial ruin. "Then, where is the money?" Cameron shouted, pointing a shaking finger at the empty space in front of Bradley. "If the checks are gone, the money from her account did not just vanish into thin air. It has to sit somewhere. Transfer the balance to my business accounts right now. I am her grandson. I am the legacy of this family." "The money is gone," Cameron Bradley said, delivering the final crushing blow with absolute precision. "Your grandmother was a meticulous planner. She engineered this distribution with a strict execution window. Any funds from those specific checks that were not deposited into a verified account within 48 hours of her death were automatically subjected to a reversion clause." "What does that mean?" Howard rasped, his voice sounding dry and hollow. "It means," Bradley continued, "that the moment the bank was notified of her passing, the uncashed funds were immediately swept out of the holding account and reabsorbed into a blind, irrevocable, charitable trust. The transfer is automatic and permanent. That trust is managed by an independent board in New York. The $24 million will be dispersed to various wildlife and literacy charities over the next 50 years. You have 0 legal claim to it. You cannot sue the trust. You cannot petition the board. The money you burned is permanently out of your reach." The absolute finality of Bradley's words struck the room like a physical shockwave. The escape routes were all systematically sealed. There was no legal loophole. There was no medical override. There was no hidden secondary account waiting to bail them out. Beatrice had locked the doors, barred the windows, and watched them strike the match themselves. Cameron began to pace the room again, but his movements were erratic, devoid of his usual confident swagger. He gripped his head, his fingers pulling violently at his own hair. He was muttering to himself a frantic stream of numbers and names. I could hear him whispering about his creditors, the massive bridge loans, the foreign investors who were expecting a return by the end of the month. He had leveraged everything he owned against the promise of this inheritance. His entire life was built on a foundation of debt, and the only asset that could have saved him was currently sitting as gray ash at the bottom of his parents' fireplace. "I am going to lose everything!" Cameron gasped, his back hitting the glass wall of the conference room. "The investors are going to seize the downtown properties. They will take my house. They will liquidate my personal accounts. I am completely bankrupt." Howard sat frozen, staring blankly at the mahogany grain of the table. He had secretly funneled his own retirement funds into Cameron's failing business, risking his own financial security to prop up his golden boy. He had taken out secret secondary mortgages on the family estate just to keep Cameron afloat, entirely confident that Beatrice's millions would replenish his accounts. He was drowning right alongside his son. Diane buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, wretched sobs. She was not crying for Beatrice. She was not crying for the loss of a loved one. She was mourning the loss of her social status. She was grieving the country club memberships, the luxury vacations, the designer clothes that would soon evaporate when the creditors came to collect on Howard's secret debts. I remained perfectly still at the far end of the table. I kept my breathing slow and measured, maintaining an expression of calm neutrality. I was watching a masterclass in karmic justice unfold in real time. For 33 years, I had been the family scapegoat. I had been dismissed, mocked, and financially cut off because I chose to build a quiet, honest career rather than participate in their toxic, high-stakes charades. Now the architects of my misery were burying themselves in their own greed. Cameron stopped pacing. He stood frozen near the window, his chest rising and falling heavily. He stared at the floor, his mind desperately spinning for a way out, any possible lifeline to drag himself out of the financial grave he had dug. Then his frantic movements ceased entirely. He slowly raised his head. His eyes darted from the center of the table past his weeping mother, past his paralyzed father, and slowly drifted down the length of the long room. He remembered Christmas night. He remembered the roaring fire, the mocking laughter, the sound of heavy paper tearing. He remembered demanding I throw my envelope into the flames. He remembered that I had quietly refused. He remembered that I had folded my check, placed it inside my leather purse, and zipped it shut. Cameron's bloodshot eyes locked directly onto mine. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The shift in his expression was immediate and terrifying. The blind panic twisting his features morphed violently into a dark, predatory focus. He was no longer looking at his sister. He was looking at a walking, breathing bank vault. Howard, sensing the sudden change in the atmosphere, slowly lifted his head. He followed the trajectory of Cameron's gaze, his eyes tracking down the table until they rested on me. The realization hit him a second later. The patriarch's posture instantly straightened, the fog of defeat clearing from his eyes as a desperate, calculating light ignited within them. Diane lowered her hands from her tear-streaked face. She sniffled, wiping her ruined makeup, and turned her head to follow her husband's stare. All 3 sets of eyes were now fixated entirely on me. The silence stretched thick and dangerous. Nobody breathed. Nobody moved. They were mentally rewinding the events of that holiday dinner, confirming the singular, undeniable truth that was currently staring them in the face. I was the only person who had treated Beatrice with respect. I was the only person who had walked out of that house with an intact piece of paper. I did not shrink under their collective stare. I sat with my back perfectly straight, my hands resting neatly in my lap. I met Cameron's desperate gaze with absolute, unwavering calm. The power dynamic in our family, a rigid hierarchy that had been violently enforced since the day I was born, shattered into a million pieces. The golden boy was bankrupt. The wealthy patriarch was drowning in secret debt. The image-obsessed mother was facing absolute social ruin. And the invisible, disappointing daughter sitting at the end of the table was holding exactly $6 million of cleared, verified, untethered liquid cash. Cameron took a slow, deliberate step toward me, his hands curling into fists at his sides. The desperation in his eyes had been entirely replaced by a sickening, entitled expectation. The true battle was no longer about the money they had burned. It was about the money they were now absolutely certain belonged to them. The frantic knocking started at exactly 6:30 the following evening. I was sitting at my kitchen island entering the final code blocks for a major user interface update while my fiancé Ian was cooking dinner. The heavy pounding against the apartment door was erratic and aggressive. We did not have a doorman in our building, and whoever was outside had simply bypassed the buzzer system by slipping in behind another tenant. I shared a look with Ian. He slowly wiped his hands on a dish towel, his jaw tightening. I pulled up the security camera feed on my phone. Standing in the hallway, glaring directly into the lens were my parents, Howard and Diane. "Let them in," I told Ian, my voice steady. "It is better to get this over with now." Ian opened the door, and Howard immediately pushed past him, stepping into our living room with the arrogant assumption that he owned the space simply by occupying it. Diane followed close behind, her eyes quickly scanning the modest but comfortable apartment, taking mental inventory of everything we owned. Neither of them offered a greeting to Ian. They did not take off their coats. They marched straight toward the kitchen island where I was sitting. Howard did not waste a single second on pleasantries. He slammed a heavy leather folder onto the counter right next to my laptop. The thud made my coffee cup rattle. "We need to get this resolved immediately," Howard commanded, his voice tight and breathless. He was wearing the same suit he had worn to the lawyer's office yesterday, and he looked exhausted. "I have the routing numbers for Cameron's primary business accounts right here. I have spoken to my corporate attorney, and we have drafted a family restructuring agreement. We need you to initiate a wire transfer for exactly $4.5 million by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." I stared at the leather folder, then slowly looked up at my father. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "You broke into my building uninvited to hand me a piece of paper demanding I wire $4.5 million to my brother." "It is not a demand." Fiona Howard snapped, his face flushing with immediate annoyance. "It is a necessary reallocation of family assets." Beatrice made a colossal mistake by attempting to distribute her wealth without consulting me. She was clearly suffering from cognitive decline, and she created a massive logistical nightmare. Now we have to clean up her mess. The bridge loan on Cameron's downtown project is officially defaulting on Friday. If we do not inject liquidity into his holding company immediately, the investors are going to pull their capital and seize the collateral. The family legacy is on the line. I am giving you the instructions on how to fix this. "You are giving me instructions," I repeated, shaking my head in sheer disbelief. "Dad, the money belongs to me. It is in my personal account. It is not family capital. You have absolutely zero authority over it." Diane let out a sharp, dramatic sigh, stepping forward and placing her hand flat against the counter. She attempted to use her soothing maternal voice, a tone she only deployed when she was trying to manipulate someone into submission. "Fiona, darling, you need to be reasonable," Diane said, her eyes wide with manufactured concern. "You are entirely overwhelmed by this situation, and you are not thinking clearly. We understand that this is a lot of money, and we do not expect you to hand over all of it. We are perfectly willing to let you keep $1.5 million. That is more than enough for you. You can buy a nice little house and invest the rest into your little design career." "My little design career," I echoed, feeling the familiar heat of anger rising in my chest. "Yes," Diane continued, completely oblivious to my rising fury. "You draw buttons on computers, Fiona. It is a cute job, but it is not a real business. Cameron is building skyscrapers. He is developing commercial properties. He is building the Blackwell Empire.
You cannot possibly understand the intense pressure he is under. He has massive overhead and incredibly aggressive investors. He needs that capital to secure his legacy. You simply do not need $6 million to live your quiet little life. Family requires sacrifice. It is time for you to step up and do the right thing for your brother. I looked at my mother, truly seeing her for what she was. She was not asking for a favor. She was demanding my submission. She fully believed that my entire existence, my financial security, and my autonomy should be cheerfully sacrificed to prop up her golden boy's spectacular failures. You want me to sacrifice my inheritance to save Cameron? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Exactly, Howard interjected, leaning heavily against the counter. We knew you would understand once we explained the stakes. I will call the bank manager first thing in the morning and authorize the transfer on your behalf. I slowly pushed the leather folder back across the island, sliding it directly toward my father. No, I said. Howard froze. His hand paused halfway to the folder. He looked at me as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. Excuse me, he demanded. I said no. I repeated, pronouncing the word with absolute clarity. I am not wiring Cameron $4.5 million. I am not wiring him $4. I am not giving you a single cent. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. Ian stood quietly near the stove, a silent physical barrier between me and the hallway. Howard's face turned a deep, violently angry shade of red. Fiona, you will do exactly what I tell you to do, he roared, slamming his fist against the counter. You are my daughter. You do not dictate financial policy in this family. That money was meant for Cameron. Beatrice was senile and she made a mistake. You are going to correct it right now. She was not senile, Dad, I shot back, standing up from my chair and matching his volume. She was brilliant. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew that you and Cameron were arrogant and greedy and entirely self-absorbed. She handed you your inheritance on a silver platter. You held $6 million in your own hands, both of you. And what did you do? I leaned forward, bracing my hands against the island, locking eyes with my father. You tore it into pieces and threw it in the fireplace because you wanted to mock her. You burned your own money to ashes because your ego was too massive to accept a gift from a woman you thought was beneath you. Do not speak to me like that, Howard shouted, pointing a shaking finger at my face. I will speak to you exactly how I want to. I snapped, refusing to back down. You made your choice. You burned your salvation. You burned Cameron's bailout. You burned your precious family legacy. And now you expect me to clean up your mess. You expect me to hand over the only piece of the fortune that survived simply because I was the only person at that table who showed a shred of basic human respect. The answer is absolutely not. You will never see a dime of that money. It is mine, and it is locked away. Diane let out a sharp, hysterical gasp. She stepped back from the counter, clutching her expensive handbag to her chest. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. The maternal manipulation vanished entirely, replaced by absolute rage. You selfish little traitor, Diane screamed, her voice echoing shrilly through the apartment. You ungrateful, vicious little girl. We gave you everything. We clothed you and fed you and raised you. And the moment you get a taste of real money, you turn your back on your own blood. You are deliberately trying to ruin your brother out of pure jealousy. You always hated him because he was better than you. Because he was successful and you were just a pathetic little artist. He is not successful, Mom. I fired back the truth, hitting the room like a physical blow. He is bankrupt. He is a fraud. He has been stringing along investors for years and now his house of cards is collapsing. And you are so desperate to maintain your country club image that you are willing to rob your own daughter to keep his lies afloat. How dare you? Howard bellowed, lunging slightly forward. Ian immediately stepped in front of the island, physically blocking my father's path. That is enough, Ian stated, his voice low, deep, and entirely uncompromising. You need to leave, right now. Howard stopped, glaring at Ian with absolute contempt. You stay out of this. This is family business. Not anymore, Ian replied. Fiona gave you her answer. The money is hers. Now get out of our home before I call building security and have you physically removed for trespassing. Howard stared at Ian, his chest heaving. He looked back at me, the pure hatred in his eyes sending a brief chill down my spine. This was not a father looking at his child. This was a cornered predator looking at an obstacle. "You are making the biggest mistake of your life," Fiona Howard hissed, his voice dropping to a dangerous, menacing whisper. "You think you can steal my family's legacy and just walk away? You have absolutely no idea what I am capable of. I will make sure you lose every single penny. I will break you." He grabbed the leather folder off the counter, turning sharply on his heel. "Come, Diane, we are done here." Diane glared at me, her eyes brimming with toxic, furious tears. "You are dead to me," she spat, her voice shaking. "Do not ever call me again." They stormed out of the apartment, slamming the front door so hard the framed pictures on the hallway wall rattled. I stood in the kitchen, my heart hammering against my ribs, my hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline crash. I had done it. For the first time in 33 years, I had looked my parents in the eye and absolutely refused to submit to their abuse. Ian wrapped his arms around me, pulling me into a tight, protective embrace. He buried his face in my hair, holding me steady as the reality of what just happened settled over me. "You were incredible," he murmured, kissing the top of my head. "You set the boundary. You held the line." I hugged him back, resting my forehead against his chest. It felt like I had just survived a massive earthquake. The initial shockwave had passed, but the structural damage was permanent. I had drawn the line in the sand, and I knew with absolute terrifying certainty that my father was not making an empty threat. He was going to come after me. The war had just officially begun. The very next morning, the retaliation started before the sun even fully cleared the Chicago skyline. I was standing in the kitchen pouring my first cup of coffee when Ian's cell phone buzzed on the kitchen island. He glanced at the screen and his brow furrowed. It was an unknown number, but the area code was from the affluent suburb where my parents lived. Ian answered, putting it on speakerphone so I could hear. "Ian, dear, it is Diane." My mother's voice drifted out of the speaker. It was sickeningly sweet, laced with an artificial tremor of maternal distress. "I know things got a little heated last night, but I am calling because I am genuinely terrified for Fiona." Ian leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "What exactly are you terrified of, Diane?" he asked, his tone perfectly polite, but offering absolutely no warmth. My mother let out a practiced, fragile sigh. "Fiona is not well, Ian. She has always had these episodes of instability and greed, but this time she has gone too far. She manipulated my poor senile mother-in-law in her final days. Beatrice had no idea what she was signing, and Fiona took advantage of a dementia-riddled woman to steal Cameron's business capital. She robbed her own family, Ian. I am telling you this because I care about you. You are marrying a woman who is currently committing elder financial abuse. She is going to drag you down with her when the authorities get involved." I stood frozen, the coffee pot trembling in my hand. She was attempting to poison the one person who stood between me and their wrath. She was framing me as a criminal to my own fiancé. Ian did not miss a beat. "Diane," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, unyielding register. "I was standing right next to Fiona when you and Howard broke into our home. I heard you demand her money to bail out your bankrupt son. Do not ever call my phone again to peddle your pathetic lies. If you or your husband attempt to contact me, I will file a harassment charge." He ended the call and instantly blocked the number. He looked up at me, offering a reassuring smile, but I could feel the cold dread pooling in my stomach. If my mother was willing to call Ian, she was not going to stop there. My fears were validated exactly 3 hours later. I was sitting at my desk at the tech firm reviewing interface wireframes when my office phone rang. It was the executive assistant to the vice president of human resources requesting my immediate presence on the top floor. I walked into the massive corner office to find the VP standing behind her desk, looking profoundly uncomfortable. "Fiona, please sit," she instructed, gesturing to a chair. "I received a highly concerning phone call this morning from a woman claiming to be your mother. She stated that you are currently the subject of an active criminal investigation for grand larceny and elder fraud.
She claimed you stole $24 million from a compromised elderly relative. The sheer audacity of Diane's campaign hit me like a physical blow. She was actively trying to destroy my career. She was trying to strip away the independent life I had built so I would have no choice but to crawl back to them. I took a deep breath, forcing my hands to remain still on my lap. I looked my VP directly in the eye. "My mother is lying," I stated with absolute clarity. "My grandmother recently passed away and legally bequeathed her estate to me. My family is attempting to contest the distribution because my brother is facing bankruptcy. They demanded I give them the money last night and I refused. There is no criminal investigation. I have broken no laws. This is a malicious smear campaign designed to intimidate me into handing over my inheritance." The VP let out a long breath, visibly relaxing. "I assumed as much given your flawless track record here, but corporate policy dictates that I must inquire when such serious allegations are reported. I will document this as a domestic dispute and instruct reception to block all calls from anyone claiming to be your family. Your job is entirely secure, Fiona." I thanked her and returned to my desk, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had survived the professional ambush, but Diane was just getting started. By noon, the isolation tactics were deployed with terrifying efficiency. My personal cell phone began vibrating non-stop. It started with text messages and escalated to a relentless barrage of voicemails and social media notifications. My parents had mobilized the entire extended family and their affluent country club social circle. They had spun a narrative portraying Cameron as the hardworking victim and me as the greedy, manipulative villain who had swooped in to rob a dying woman. I opened my phone to find a message from my Aunt Martha. "How could you do this to your own brother? He has a business to run, and you steal his legacy to fund your selfish lifestyle. You are a monster." Then came a voicemail from a family friend I had known since childhood. "Fiona, we are all so disappointed in you. Your mother is completely devastated. Return the money you stole before you end up in prison. You are a gold digger tearing your own family apart." The messages poured in wave after wave of toxic judgment from people who had not spoken to me in years. Cousins, uncles, family acquaintances, they all bought Diane's story without a single question. I was bombarded with words like thief, sociopath, and traitor. They accused me of leaving my brother destitute. They claimed I was dancing on my grandmother's grave. The psychological toll was immediate and crushing. I sat in a bathroom stall at work, clutching my phone, reading message after hateful message. It is one thing to know your parents are toxic, but it is an entirely different level of trauma to watch them successfully convince dozens of people that you are a monster. The sheer volume of the hatred made me question my own sanity. I felt the walls closing in. The social suffocation was designed to break my spirit, to make me feel so entirely alone and despised that I would surrender the money just to make the pain stop. I left work early, unable to focus on digital interfaces while my character was being publicly assassinated. When I walked through the door of my apartment, Ian took one look at my pale face and immediately sprang into action. He did not offer empty platitudes or tell me to just ignore them. He recognized that we were under siege, and he treated it like a tactical defense operation. "Give me your phone," Ian commanded gently, prying the device from my shaking hands. "You are not reading any more of these." He sat me down on the sofa, wrapping a heavy blanket around my shoulders, and went straight to work. He spent the next 4 hours sitting at the kitchen island, systematically documenting every single piece of harassment. He took screenshots of every hateful text message. He saved every threatening voicemail. He recorded the names and timestamps of the social media comments attacking my character. He was building an ironclad file of evidence. After he secured the data, he ruthlessly blocked every offending number. He locked down my social media profiles, setting everything to the highest privacy restrictions. He created a digital fortress around me, cutting off their avenues of attack. I sat on the couch, feeling incredibly small. The mental strain was testing the very limits of my resilience. The little voice of doubt, the one my parents had cultivated inside my head for 33 years, began to whisper. Maybe I should just give them the money. Maybe peace is worth $4.5 million. Maybe I really am destroying the family. Ian walked over and sat beside me, pulling me against his side. I voiced my doubts to him, my voice cracking under the immense pressure. I asked him if fighting this war was actually worth the emotional devastation. Ian lifted my chin, forcing me to look into his steady, reassuring eyes. Fiona listened to me carefully. He said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. They are doing this because they are terrified. They are using social pressure because they have absolutely zero legal leverage. If they had a real case, they would be sending lawyers, not angry text messages from your Aunt Martha. They want you to break because they know they cannot win any other way. He pulled the thick folder of printed screenshots he had compiled and dropped it onto the coffee table. Every single message in this file is proof of their desperation, Ian continued. Your mother is burning her own dignity to the ground just to intimidate you. Do not let her win. You earned your peace. You earned your freedom. And your grandmother made sure you had the armor to protect it. His unwavering support was the anchor I desperately needed. Ian was not intimidated by their wealth or their country club connections. He saw right through the gaslighting and the smear campaign. With his arms around me, the crushing weight of the isolation began to lift. I was not alone. I had a partner who was perfectly willing to stand in the fire with me. I looked at the folder of evidence resting on the table. My mother thought she could use social pressure to force my surrender. She thought she could isolate me and destroy my reputation until I crumbled. But she had fundamentally miscalculated my strength. I was no longer the silent, obedient scapegoat who took their abuse quietly. I was a woman holding the keys to an empire, and I was done playing defense. The smear campaign had tested my mental resilience, but it had also hardened my resolve into absolute steel. I was ready to strike back. The fallout from the confrontation at my apartment was terrifyingly swift. My father had threatened to break me, and he possessed the capital and the sheer vindictive will to execute that threat with military precision. I expected nasty phone calls from extended family, or perhaps a dramatic disownment letter. I did not expect a process server to ambush me outside my office building at 8 o'clock in the morning. I was holding a coffee, walking toward the revolving glass doors of my building, when a man in a beige trench coat stepped directly into my path. He confirmed my name, thrust a thick manila envelope into my hands, and walked away without another word. I stood on the sidewalk, the cold Chicago wind whipping around me, and opened the envelope. It was an emergency injunction filed in the Cook County Circuit Court. The plaintiff was Cameron. The defendant was me. The charge listed at the top of the document made my blood run instantly cold. Elder financial abuse and fraudulent inducement. Cameron was not just suing me for the money. He was actively attempting to destroy my life. He was filing a civil suit that carried massive criminal implications. The paperwork alleged that I had spent months manipulating a vulnerable 82-year-old woman, systematically isolating her from her loving family, to orchestrate the theft of her entire liquid estate. The narrative they spun was a grotesque work of fiction, painting me as a calculating predator who swooped in during Beatrice's final days to rob my own brother of his rightful legacy. I rushed up to my office, locked the door, and frantically read through the attached exhibits. The centerpiece of their lawsuit was a sworn medical affidavit. It was signed by a Dr. Eris Thorne, a prominent local neurologist. I recognized the name immediately. Dr. Thorne was a regular fixture at my parents' country club dinners and a frequent golf partner of my father's. The affidavit was devastating. Dr. Thorne claimed that he had informally evaluated Beatrice at a holiday gathering on December 20th, just 5 days before Christmas. He stated under oath that she was exhibiting severe signs of advanced dementia, profound confusion, and an inability to comprehend basic financial concepts. He concluded that she was entirely incapable of making independent legal or financial decisions on the day she distributed the checks. It was a blatant, fabricated lie. Beatrice had not attended a single holiday gathering with my parents in over 3 years, precisely because she despised their social circle. The document was completely backdated, a piece of manufactured evidence bought and paid for by my father to provide the legal leverage Cameron desperately needed. But to a judge looking at a sworn statement from a respected medical professional, it was enough to trigger immediate action. I pulled out my phone to call Ian when a notification popped up on the screen. It was an alert from my banking app. I tapped the icon to open my accounts, but the login screen froze. A bold red message appeared stating that access to my accounts had been temporarily suspended due to a court-ordered freeze. Panic. A cold, sharp spike of absolute terror shot through my chest. I tried to log into my business account, the one I used to pay for my software subscriptions and freelance contractors. Blocked. I tried my personal savings account, the one containing the money I had earned through years of grueling 60-hour work weeks. Blocked. I even tried my basic checking account, the one I used to buy groceries. Blocked. Cameron and my father had not just frozen the $6 million. They had weaponized the emergency injunction to freeze every single financial asset attached to my name. They had effectively locked me out of my own life. I had no access to the inheritance, but more terrifyingly, I had no access to the money I actually needed to survive. They were starving me out. They wanted me to feel the exact same desperate, suffocating panic that Cameron was currently experiencing with his creditors. I called Mr. Harrison at the bank, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. He answered immediately, his voice tight with professional regret. "Fiona, I am so sorry," Mr. Harrison said, before I even asked the question. "We received the court order an hour ago. We are legally bound to comply with the asset freeze pending the preliminary hearing. I cannot authorize any disbursements, not even for basic living expenses. Your brother's legal team filed an incredibly aggressive motion, claiming you were a flight risk." "How long will this last?" I asked, my voice cracking. "How am I supposed to pay my rent? How am I supposed to buy food?" "The preliminary hearing is scheduled for 2 weeks from now," Mr. Harrison replied, his tone deeply sympathetic. "Until the judge reviews the evidence and issues a ruling, your assets are completely immobilized. I strongly advise you to secure immediate legal representation, Fiona. Your family is not playing games. They are trying to bury you." I hung up the phone feeling completely unmoored. I was 33 years old, pulling in a massive corporate salary, and I suddenly did not have the funds to buy a sandwich for lunch. My father had promised to break me, and he had executed his first strike flawlessly. He knew that I prided myself on my fierce independence. By freezing my hard-earned money, he was attempting to humiliate me, forcing me into a position of total reliance. I called Ian, explaining the situation through tears of sheer frustration. He was furious, but he did not panic. He told me to come home immediately. When I walked through the door, he already had his laptop open and a notebook out. "They want you to feel helpless," Ian said, pulling me into a hug. "But you are not. My accounts are not frozen. My salary is perfectly fine. We will use my money for rent, food, and bills. You are not going to starve, and you are certainly not going to surrender. We are going to fight this." His unwavering support stabilized me, but the reality of the legal battle loomed over us like a dark storm cloud. I was facing a protracted, expensive lawsuit against a family that possessed nearly limitless resources. Howard could afford to keep me tied up in litigation for years, bleeding me dry with attorney fees, until I was forced to settle just to survive. They had a corrupt doctor willing to commit perjury. I had nothing but a folded piece of paper and my own word. I needed a lawyer, but the cruel irony was that I could not access my own funds to pay a retainer. I felt trapped in a brilliantly designed legal cage. I sat on the couch, staring blankly at the wall, my mind racing through every possible scenario, trying to find a weak point in their attack. Then I remembered the name on the manila folder at the will reading. Bradley. He was Beatrice's estate attorney. He was the one who had presented the 3 independent psychiatric evaluations to my father. He was the one who knew exactly what my grandmother had planned. And most importantly, he was the one who had defended her mental competence with absolute conviction. I found his contact information from the business card he had handed out at the will reading. I called his office expecting to be brushed off by a receptionist or told he could not represent me due to a conflict of interest.
Instead, the receptionist put me on hold for less than 30 seconds before Bradley himself picked up the line.
Fiona, Bradley said, his voice crisp and professional. I was wondering how long it would take for Howard to execute the asset freeze. He filed the injunction this morning, I presume. You knew this was going to happen, I asked, gripping the phone tightly. Your father is a remarkably predictable man, Bradley replied dryly. He operates entirely on brute force and intimidation. He believes that if he applies enough financial pressure, you will simply hand over the $6 million to avoid the legal headache. I have reviewed the injunction. Dr. Thorne's affidavit is a spectacular piece of fiction. Can you help me? I asked, the desperation clear in my voice. They froze my personal accounts. I cannot even afford to hire you right now. Bradley let out a small, sharp laugh. Fiona, you do not need to hire me. I am already working for you. I frowned, completely confused. What do you mean? Your grandmother was a master tactician. Bradley explained, his tone shifting into something almost resembling warmth. She knew exactly what Howard and Cameron would do. She knew they would attempt to destroy you if you survived the Christmas dinner test. She did not just leave you a check, Fiona. She left you an arsenal. He paused, letting the words sink in. I need you to come to my office tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp, Bradley continued. Use a side entrance to avoid any private investigators your father may have hired. We have a considerable amount of work to do. It is time to show you exactly what Beatrice was preparing while your family was busy underestimating her. I hung up the phone, a new spark of defiant hope igniting in my chest. Howard and Cameron thought they had me cornered. They thought freezing my bank accounts would break my spirit. They had absolutely no idea that Beatrice had planned for this exact moment, and she had left me the keys to a kingdom they knew nothing about. The trap had been sprung, but I was not the one locked inside it. The next morning, I walked through the biting wind of the Chicago financial district, pulling my wool coat tightly around myself. Following Bradley's precise instructions, I bypassed the grand revolving glass doors of his firm building and navigated down a narrow delivery alley. I found the unmarked service elevator he had mentioned. A security guard expecting my arrival nodded silently and swiped a keycard, granting me direct access to the executive floor. I stepped out into a quiet, dimly lit corridor, completely unseen by the public or any private investigators my father might have lurking in the main lobby. Bradley was waiting for me in a private boardroom at the end of the hall. The space was completely isolated from the rest of the bustling law firm. He sat at a round marble table, 2 cups of steaming black coffee resting on the polished surface. He looked entirely relaxed, reading a leather-bound dossier with the calm demeanor of a man who held all the winning cards. Please sit down, Fiona, he said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. I trust your journey here was undetected. I think so, I replied, taking the seat and wrapping my cold hands around the warm coffee mug. But Bradley, they froze everything. My personal savings, my business accounts. Cameron filed an injunction accusing me of elder abuse. They even got Dr. Thorne to sign a sworn affidavit claiming my grandmother was incompetent. I have absolutely no access to the $6 million or my own salary. Bradley took a slow sip of his coffee. He did not look surprised. He did not look concerned. A slight knowing smile played at the corners of his mouth. Your father is a very aggressive man, but he lacks imagination, Bradley stated, setting his mug down. Howard plays chess like a brute, simply trying to smash the pieces off the board. Beatrice, on the other hand, played a game they could not even comprehend. She anticipated this exact maneuver, Fiona. She knew the moment they realized they had burned their inheritance, they would attempt to weaponize the legal system against you. She predicted the injunction, the false medical claims, and the asset freeze. She knew her son and grandson were predictable, greedy monsters. I stared at him, trying to process his absolute calm. If she knew they would do this, why did she hand out the checks at all? Why not just wire the money or leave it in a standard will? Because the checks were never just a financial distribution, Bradley explained, leaning forward, his eyes sharp and serious. They were a character assessment. Beatrice was approaching the end of her life, and she needed to know who was worthy of holding the keys to her empire. She knew the golden boy dynamic in your family. She watched Howard and Diane diminish your accomplishments for decades while pouring endless capital into Cameron's spectacular failures. The Christmas dinner was a psychological test. She gave everyone an equal share of pure, unadulterated salvation. She wanted to see who possessed the humility to accept it and who possessed the arrogance to destroy it. She knew they would burn it, I asked, the realization sending a chill down my spine. She strongly suspected they would Bradley corrected, but she needed them to execute the destruction themselves. By tearing up those checks, Howard and Cameron voluntarily surrendered their legal claim to her liquid estate. They cannot argue she cut them out of the will. She physically handed them their millions, and they chose to incinerate it. It was a brilliant ironclad legal trap designed to weed out the arrogant. You were the only person at that table who showed her a shred of basic human respect. You folded that check and put it in your purse. You passed the test, Fiona. But passing the test just got my life completely locked down. I argued the panic from yesterday threatening to return. I cannot fight a protracted legal battle against my father. He will bleed me dry with attorney fees until I am forced to surrender. Bradley reached across the table and placed his hand flat on the leather dossier. That is exactly what Howard thinks will happen. He believes the $6 million is the entirety of the prize. He believes he has frozen your only weapon. What he does not understand is that the liquid cash was merely the tip of the iceberg. Bradley opened the heavy dossier. Inside were stacks of complex corporate documents, stock certificates, and legally binding holding agreements. Your grandmother was not just a wealthy widow living quietly in Oak Park. Bradley continued, his voice dropping to a hushed, reverent tone. Beatrice was a silent apex predator in the commercial real estate market. She operated entirely through proxy firms and blind trusts. She possessed a staggering amount of capital and an absolute genius for market timing. Over the last 10 years, she closely monitored Cameron's highly publicized business ventures. She watched him make terrible, highly leveraged decisions. I looked down at the documents, recognizing the names of several major Chicago development projects Cameron had boasted about over the years. When traditional banks stopped lending to Cameron due to his catastrophic risk profile, he sought private equity bridge loans, Bradley explained. He needed massive injections of cash, with exorbitant interest rates, just to keep his construction sites from facing foreclosure. He thought he was borrowing from a faceless, aggressive investment syndicate based in New York. Bradley paused, letting the silence stretch for a moment to ensure I understood the magnitude of what he was about to say. He was borrowing from Beatrice, Bradley stated. My breath caught in my throat. I looked from the documents to Bradley, completely stunned. Beatrice was the shadow investor, I whispered, my mind racing. She holds his debt. She holds all of his debt, Bradley confirmed, a sharp, victorious gleam in his eye. Cameron's entire commercial real estate firm is heavily mortgaged to a holding company called Vanguard Apex Solutions. Vanguard Apex Solutions was 100% owned and operated by your grandmother. She is his primary creditor. Every single building he is currently developing, every piece of collateral he has pledged belongs to her if he defaults. And as we both know, Cameron is currently facing imminent default. He needs that $4.5 million he demanded from you to pay the interest on the loans he actually owes to the very woman he mocked. The sheer brilliant poetic justice of my grandmother's plan hit me with the force of a freight train. Cameron had spent years strutting around Chicago, acting like a titan of industry, completely oblivious to the fact that his elderly grandmother was holding the leash the entire time. He had literally thrown a $6 million check into the fire, a check that would have cleared his debts to her. Now he was bankrupt and legally trapped. But Beatrice is gone, I said, pointing to the paperwork. What happens to Vanguard Apex Solutions now? Bradley slid the heavy dossier directly across the marble table until it rested right in front of me. He pulled a sleek silver pen from his breast pocket and laid it on top of the documents. That brings us to the secondary documents Beatrice signed 3 days before she passed, Bradley said. She established a strict succession plan for the holding company contingent entirely upon the results of the Christmas test. If you had burned your check, Vanguard Apex Solutions would have been dissolved and the assets donated to charity. Because you kept the check and deposited it, the contingency was triggered. I stared at the thick stack of legal paperwork, my heart hammering wildly against my ribs. Fiona Bradley said, his voice carrying absolute, unquestionable authority. You are not just the beneficiary of a $6 million check. As of this morning, the legal transfer is complete. You are now the sole controlling manager and majority shareholder of Vanguard Apex Solutions. You hold the absolute power to call in Cameron's debt. You hold the power to foreclose on his properties. You hold the entire Blackwell family legacy in the palm of your hand. I reached out and touched the leather cover of the dossier. My fingers were trembling slightly, but not from fear. The sensation coursing through my veins was raw, unadulterated power. For 33 years, my parents and my brother had made me feel small, insignificant, and helpless. They had bullied me, diminished my career, and demanded my total submission. They thought freezing my personal bank accounts would break my spirit and force me to surrender. Instead, they had unwittingly forced me to inherit the very weapon that could destroy them completely. We have already filed an emergency counter-injunction against Howard and Cameron, Bradley informed me, leaning back in his chair. We are presenting evidence of the fraudulent medical affidavit to the judge this afternoon. Your personal accounts will be unfrozen within 48 hours. But more importantly, we are going to initiate an aggressive audit of Cameron's corporate finances, using your authority as his primary creditor. Your father has been desperately hiding something in those ledgers, and we are going to drag it into the light. I picked up the silver pen, feeling its cool weight in my hand. I opened the dossier and looked at the signature lines requiring my authorization to assume control of the holding company. I thought about the arrogant smirk on my brother's face when he tore the check. I thought about my mother screaming at me, calling me a selfish traitor. I thought about my father threatening to destroy my life if I did not bow to his demands. They wanted a war. They wanted to show me what they were capable of when challenged. I signed my name on the dotted line, my signature bold and decisive. I closed the folder and pushed it back toward Bradley. Let us audit my brother, I said, my voice entirely devoid of the scared girl they thought they knew. It is time to show them exactly who is running the family now. Bradley wasted absolutely no time. Within 48 hours, he had the emergency counter-injunction sitting in front of a Cook County judge. He did not just dispute the freeze on my personal accounts. He presented undeniable evidence linking Dr. Thorne directly to my father. He submitted country club logs showing their weekly golf games and financial records proving my father had recently made a massive anonymous donation to Dr. Thorne's private research clinic. The judge was absolutely furious. Using the court system to weaponize a fraudulent medical affidavit was a serious offense. The judge immediately struck down Cameron's injunction, unfreezing my personal assets and granting me full unrestricted access to the Vanguard Apex Solutions operational accounts. The moment the funds cleared, I authorized my first official expenditure as the head of Beatrice's empire. I instructed Bradley to hire the most ruthless forensic accounting firm in Chicago. Bradley brought in a man named Donovan. Donovan did not wear flashy suits or boast about his victories. He was a quiet, terrifyingly meticulous man who viewed corporate ledgers the way a surgeon views an MRI. He lived for the thrill of dissecting financial lies. I sat with Donovan in Bradley's conference room, sliding across the master file of the massive loans Cameron owed to Vanguard Apex Solutions. As the primary creditor holding his debt, I had the absolute legal right to demand an immediate and comprehensive audit of his business operations. Cameron had signed strict covenant agreements when he took the loans, blindly agreeing to total transparency if a default was imminent. We served Cameron's real estate development firm with the audit demand the following morning. I could only imagine the sheer panic that must have exploded in his downtown office. His lawyers filed pathetic delay motions claiming the financial records were currently under internal review and could not be securely transferred. Bradley crushed every single motion before lunch.
We threatened to immediately seize his commercial properties if he did not hand over the digital ledgers by the close of business. Facing total foreclosure, Cameron capitulated. He turned over the servers. Donovan and his team of analysts set up a war room in Bradley's office. For 3 days, they worked around the clock, ripping through Cameron's accounting software. Ian and I brought them coffee watching as they systematically dismantled the facade of the great Blackwell real estate empire. It was not just bad business. It was a masterpiece of financial deception. On the evening of the 3rd day, Donovan called me into the war room. The walls were covered in massive whiteboards displaying a dizzying web of corporate entities, holding companies and offshore accounts. Donovan pointed to the center of the whiteboard where Cameron's primary downtown development project was listed. He explained that my brother was not a real estate developer at all. He was running a sophisticated multi-million-dollar shell game. Whenever Cameron secured capital from a new group of investors for a supposedly groundbreaking luxury condo project, he never actually used the money for construction. Instead, he instantly diverted the funds through a maze of dummy corporations to pay off the angry investors from his previous failed projects. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme dressed up in expensive suits and architectural blueprints. He was using aggressive leverage to blind his victims, promising them astronomical returns while secretly draining their initial investments to cover his massive outstanding debts. The downtown project he had boasted about so proudly at our Christmas dinner was a complete black hole. Donovan pulled up the municipal permits and the contractor invoices. Cameron had not even broken ground. The building was rotting from the inside out, while he continued to collect millions in bridge loans to sustain his lavish lifestyle. He was paying for his sports cars, his high-end office space, and his country club dues, using stolen investor capital. But the fraud did not stop with Cameron. Donovan walked over to a different whiteboard, tapping a red marker against a series of massive cash injections that had miraculously saved Cameron's firm from bankruptcy 6 months prior. These equity injections did not come from outside investors. Donovan stated, his voice deadly serious. Vanguard Apex Solutions was squeezing him for interest payments, and he was out of new victims. So he turned to the only person arrogant and blind enough to bail him out. Your father. I stared at the staggering numbers written in red ink. I knew Howard had always propped Cameron up, but the sheer scale of the financial transfers was mind-boggling. Where did my father get that kind of liquid capital? I asked, my stomach nodding. He did not have it, Donovan replied flatly. Howard drained his entire corporate retirement portfolio. He cashed out every single safe investment he had built over 40 years. He liquidated his mutual funds and took massive penalties for early withdrawal. But even that was not enough to plug the bleeding hole in Cameron's sinking ship. So Howard got desperate. Donovan pulled a thick stack of property records from the table and handed them to me. I looked down at the documents, recognizing the address immediately. It was my parents' sprawling Chicago estate. The massive brick house with the manicured lawns where I had spent my childhood, enduring their relentless emotional abuse. The house that was supposed to be completely paid off years ago. Your father took out 3 secret, highly leveraged secondary mortgages on the family estate, Donovan explained, and he committed federal fraud to do it. The property is jointly owned by both of your parents. Howard forged Diane's signature on the loan documents to bypass her authorization. He stripped all the equity out of the family home and dumped every last penny into Cameron's fraudulent shell companies. The air in the room grew heavy. My father, the man who constantly lectured me about financial responsibility, the man who called my career a joke, had secretly mortgaged his own home to save a criminal. He had risked everything my mother cared about: her social status, her massive house, her undeniable comfort, without even telling her. The great family legacy he constantly bragged about was nothing but an illusion. They were not just cash poor. They were drowning in toxic, illegal debt. If the bank finds out about the forged signature, Howard will face federal prison time, Bradley added, stepping into the room. And Cameron is already facing decades behind bars the moment his investors realize their money is gone. Your family is entirely, completely bankrupt, Fiona. They do not have a single cent to their name that does not belong to a creditor. I stood in the center of the war room staring at the whiteboards that mapped out my family's total destruction. The $24 million in checks Beatrice had handed out at Christmas finally made perfect sense. It was not just a test of character. It was an exact calculation. $6 million would have been just enough to clear Cameron's debts to Vanguard Apex Solutions and pay off the fraudulent mortgages Howard had secretly taken out on the house. Beatrice knew exactly how deep in the mud they were sinking. She had offered them a literal lifeline, and they had burned it. They had looked their salvation in the face, mocked it, and thrown it into the fire because their towering egos could not fathom that an 82-year-old woman held their fate in her hands. Now there were no lifelines left. There were no safety nets. The fire they had stoked was about to consume their entire lives. I looked at Ian, who had been standing quietly beside me, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the devastation. He wrapped his arm around my waist, grounding me. "They did this to themselves," he whispered. "You do not owe them guilt or sympathy." "I do not feel guilty," I replied, my voice resolute. "I feel vindicated." Bradley checked his phone and looked up at me. "It seems your brother is not going down without a fight," he said. Despite the audit, Cameron is doubling down on his lies. My contacts in the financial sector just forwarded me an invitation. Cameron is hosting a massive high-profile investor gala at the Grand Plaza Hotel tomorrow night. I frowned, completely confused. How can he host a gala when he is totally insolvent? Where is he getting the money to throw a party? "He is using the last of Howard's fraudulent mortgage funds," Bradley explained. "He is bringing in a syndicate of wealthy foreign investors. He plans to stand on stage and promise them that his business is backed by impending inherited family assets. He is going to use the lawsuit he filed against you as proof that a massive cash injection is coming. He intends to lie to their faces to secure one final multi-million-dollar bridge loan to cover his tracks and flee." The sheer audacity of my brother was breathtaking. Even backed into a corner with his finances fully exposed to his primary creditor, he was still trying to con his way out. He was planning to stand in a ballroom full of elite investors and use my name, my inheritance, to steal more money. I looked back at the whiteboard, then at Bradley. "He wants to talk about inherited family assets," I said, a cold, hard smile spreading across my face. "I think it is only fair that the sole controller of those assets attends the gala to verify his claims." Bradley mirrored my smile, snapping his folder shut. "I will have the legal binders prepared. Donovan, print out the executive summaries of the shell companies and the fraudulent mortgages. We are going to provide his new investors with complete financial transparency." The scared girl who used to shrink under her family's cruel gaze was dead. In her place stood the majority shareholder of Vanguard Apex Solutions. My father and my brother wanted to play a high-stakes game with my life. Now it was time to show them how the game actually ends. The next 24 hours were a masterclass in strategic execution. We did not just prepare a legal defense against my family's absurd injunction. We weaponized the absolute truth. Donovan and his team of forensic accountants worked tirelessly through the night, compiling immaculate executive summaries of Cameron's entire fraudulent operation. They printed crisp, high-gloss dossiers detailing the empty shell companies, the defaulted bridge loans, and the illegally forged secondary mortgages Howard had taken out on the family estate. Bradley drafted a formal cease and desist order regarding the lawsuit, outlining the exact federal penalties for filing false medical affidavits and committing perjury in a court of law. I spent the afternoon preparing my own armor. For 33 years, my mother Diane had dictated what I wore to family events, forcing me into muted colors and conservative cuts that ensured I blended seamlessly into the background. She wanted me invisible so her golden boy could shine. That era of subjugation was permanently over. I walked into an exclusive designer boutique downtown and purchased a breathtaking emerald green evening gown using the salary I had earned from my own technology career. The dress was sharp, architectural, and completely unapologetic. It demanded attention. When I looked in the dressing room mirror, I did not see the timid scapegoat my family had spent decades trying to break. I saw the majority shareholder of Vanguard Apex Solutions. I saw an independent woman who was about to dismantle an empire of lies. Ian stood behind me in the dressing room, smoothing his hands over my bare shoulders.
His eyes met mine in the mirror, burning with intense, fierce pride. "You look like absolute royalty," he said, his voice steady and grounding. "They are not going to know what hit them, Fiona. You are going to walk into that room and reclaim your life." The Grand Plaza Hotel was the undisputed crown jewel of Chicago's luxury venues, and Cameron had rented its largest, most opulent ballroom for his grand deception. As our black car pulled up to the valet, we could see the sheer, staggering scale of the financial illusion my brother was projecting to the world. Massive, towering floral arrangements of white orchids flanked the entrance. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos carried silver trays of premium vintage champagne and imported caviar. A celebrated string quartet played softly from a raised velvet-covered dais. Every single cent paying for this breathtaking extravagance was stolen. It was funded by the last remaining drops of my father's illegally obtained mortgage money. They were throwing a $500,000 party while their home was hurtling toward foreclosure. We bypassed the main guest list check-in at the front doors. Bradley simply flashed a discreet black card to the hotel's general manager, who recognized the powerful attorney immediately. The manager quietly escorted our group through a side entrance reserved exclusively for elite dignitaries and VIPs. We slipped into the back of the crowded, brilliantly lit ballroom, blending seamlessly into the sea of wealthy investors, socialites, and industry leaders. I scanned the massive room and immediately spotted my family holding court near the center of the ballroom. They were putting on the performance of a lifetime. Diane was draped in heavy rented diamonds, laughing brightly with the wives of prominent city officials. She projected the perfect, flawless image of a carefree, wealthy matriarch. She was completely ignoring the harsh reality that she was technically living in a house currently owned by the bank. Howard stood near the premium ice sculpture, swirling a glass of expensive scotch and projecting the aura of a fearless, commanding patriarch. He looked incredibly haggard up close, the deep stress lines permanently etched into his face, but he was playing his part flawlessly for the audience. And then there was Cameron. My brother was surrounded by a tight group of wealthy foreign investors he had flown in specifically for this gala. He was gesturing expansively, pointing to gorgeous high-definition architectural renderings of his fictitious downtown development project displayed on large easels. He was practically vibrating with a desperate manic energy that he skillfully masked as entrepreneurial passion. I moved silently through the dense crowd with Ian staying close by my side. Bradley and Donovan fanned out, taking strategic positions near the heavy oak exit doors to ensure nobody could slip away unnoticed. I drifted close enough to Cameron's elite circle to hear his pitch perfectly over the ambient noise of the ballroom. "The downtown Chicago skyline is absolutely ripe for aggressive disruption," Cameron boasted, flashing his charismatic, practiced smile at a stern-looking man who appeared to be the lead investor of the foreign syndicate. "We have all the municipal permits secured, and the architectural plans are finalized. We are simply closing this final round of bridge financing tonight to accelerate the demolition phase. The returns on this project will be astronomical." The lead investor frowned, slightly swirling his drink with a look of deep skepticism. "Your proposal is incredibly ambitious, Cameron, but my financial analysts noted significant liquidity concerns in your recent quarterly reports. You have several projects stalled. We need absolute ironclad assurance of your capital reserves before my syndicate commits another $30 million to this venture." I watched Cameron's chest tighten under his bespoke suit. He was completely cornered. The investors were not fools, and they were asking the exact right questions. But Cameron's monumental arrogance provided him with a terrifyingly smooth lie. "Those liquidity concerns are entirely temporary and wildly overblown." Cameron lied without missing a single beat, his voice dripping with false confidence. "My grandmother, a highly successful and intensely private investor, recently passed away. She left her entire liquid estate directly to me. We are talking about a trust fund valued at $24 million in pure cash." The investors raised their eyebrows, clearly impressed by the massive figure. Cameron smiled, leaning in closer to seal the deal. "The capital is currently locked in a minor probate dispute because my estranged sister filed a frivolous, ridiculous contest. Cameron continued smoothly, slandering my name to total strangers. She has a long history of mental instability and greed, but we have already secured an emergency injunction against her. The judge is dismissing her baseless claim next week, and the millions will be released directly into my primary holding company. Your $30 million investment tonight is backed by absolute guaranteed generational wealth. My blood ran completely cold. The sheer scale of his deception was breathtaking. Cameron was not just lying about his failing business. He was actively committing textbook federal wire fraud right in front of my eyes. He was deliberately inducing foreign nationals to hand over $30 million based on a completely fabricated inheritance and a fraudulent lawsuit he had maliciously filed against me. He was using my name, my reputation, and the money he had literally burned in a fireplace as collateral for a massive international financial crime. The target was fully locked. I felt a sudden surge of cold, crystalline clarity wash over my entire body. My family had pushed me to the absolute breaking point. They had abused me, isolated me, and attempted to starve me out by illegally freezing my bank accounts. They thought they could use my existence as a convenient disposable prop in their criminal theater. They thought I would stay home and cry while they stole millions of dollars in my name. They were brutally, fatally wrong. Cameron clapped his hands together, signaling for the string quartet to stop playing. The sudden silence drew the attention of everyone in the room. He walked confidently toward the front of the ballroom, stepping up onto the brightly lit stage. He tapped the microphone, testing the sound. The wealthy crowd slowly turned their attention toward him, their conversations dying down to a polite, expectant murmur. Howard and Diane moved to the front row, gazing up at their golden boy with expressions of profound, manufactured pride. They looked like royalty preparing to accept their crowns. I stepped out from the shadows of the crowded room. I handed my small silk clutch purse to Ian and took the heavy leather-bound dossier from Donovan. The emerald green silk of my dress caught the brilliant light of the massive crystal chandeliers above, drawing immediate stares from the people standing nearest to me. I did not feel a single ounce of fear. I did not feel a single ounce of hesitation. I felt the absolute, unyielding power of the truth burning in my veins. I walked slowly and deliberately down the center aisle of the ballroom, the sound of my heels muffled by the thick, expensive carpet. The crowd parted around me, sensing the undeniable shift in the atmosphere. I was walking straight toward the stage, straight toward the man who had relentlessly tried to destroy my life for 33 years. The game of shadows and lies was officially over. The execution was about to begin. I did not rush my approach. I walked at a measured, deliberate pace, allowing the tension in the room to build organically. The wealthy foreign investors turned to watch me, a collective ripple of curiosity passing through their tight-knit circle. Cameron, who had been gesturing grandly toward his easel, suddenly froze mid-sentence. His hand dropped to his side, his mouth hanging slightly open as his brain struggled to process my presence. Howard and Diane twisted around in their seats, their faces instantly draining of color. My mother's eyes widened with pure, unadulterated panic, her hand flying up to clutch the heavy rented diamond necklace resting against her throat. My father half stood from his chair, his body tensing aggressively, as if preparing for a physical altercation. I ignored them entirely, focusing my attention solely on the man holding the microphone. Cameron recovered from his initial shock and quickly masked his panic with a thin veneer of arrogant annoyance. "Fiona," he said, speaking directly into the microphone, his voice carrying a condescending edge. "What an unexpected surprise. We are right in the middle of closing a major financial round. I thought you were currently handling some sensitive legal issues regarding your unfortunate mental health situation." A low murmur rolled through the crowd. Cameron was doubling down publicly, doubling down on the lie that I was an unstable threat to the family. He thought he could shame me into retreating by weaponizing the false narrative he had constructed. I did not stop walking. I bypassed the front row, stepping directly onto the small elevated stage. I moved past Cameron, entirely ignoring his posturing, and approached the lead investor, the man Cameron had been so desperately trying to impress just moments prior. I handed the man the crisp, high-gloss dossier that Donovan and his team had painstakingly prepared. "Good evening, gentlemen," I said, projecting my voice clearly and confidently so it carried across the quiet ballroom. "My name is Fiona.
I am the sole controlling manager and majority shareholder of Vanguard Apex Solutions, the primary holding company that officially owns the entirety of my brother's commercial real estate debt. The lead investor frowned, his thick eyebrows drawing together. He looked down at the dossier in his hands, then back up at me. Vanguard Apex Solutions, he repeated. Your brother just explicitly stated that his collateral is entirely unencumbered and backed by $24 million in inherited family assets. He stated that the lawsuit against you was a mere formality to release those funds. Cameron lunged forward, grabbing my arm with a crushing grip, his eyes wild with terror. She is lying, he hissed into the microphone, his voice cracking violently. She is a completely unhinged sociopath. Security! Get security in here immediately to remove her. Ian stepped instantly onto the stage, placing his hand firmly over Cameron's wrist, twisting it just enough to force him to release his grip. Do not touch her again, Ian stated, his voice dangerously low. Bradley ascended the stage steps, standing shoulder to shoulder with me, presenting a unified front of absolute legal authority. The prominent attorney adjusted his glasses, looking directly at the lead investor. My client is telling you the absolute truth, sir, Bradley announced, projecting his voice to reach the back of the room. Cameron is completely and totally insolvent. He has absolutely zero legal claim to any inherited family assets. He voluntarily destroyed his own inheritance on Christmas Day in front of multiple witnesses, including myself. The ballroom erupted into a frenzy of shocked whispers. Howard shoved his chair backward, the metal scraping loudly against the floor, and stormed toward the stage. This is an outrage, Howard roared, his face purple with rage. Do not listen to a word she says. We are filing criminal charges against her tomorrow morning for elder financial abuse. She manipulated my mother to steal the family fortune. I turned slowly to face my father, gripping the microphone stand. I pulled the microphone off the clip, holding it close to my mouth, ensuring every single person in the massive room could hear exactly what I was about to say. I did not steal anything, Dad, I said, my voice perfectly steady, cutting through the rising chaos like a scalpel. Grandma Beatrice left me the keys to the kingdom because I was the only person sitting at that Christmas table who showed her an ounce of basic respect. You and Cameron burned your $6 million checks because your staggering egos could not accept a gift from a woman you thought was beneath you. I turned back to the investors, addressing them directly. The narrative my brother has sold you tonight is a complete multi-million-dollar fabrication. The downtown development project he has promised you is an empty shell. He has not broken ground because he has funneled all of his previous investment capital into paying off the catastrophic debts of his prior failed ventures. He is running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme, and you are his final marks. Cameron lunged for the microphone, his face a mask of desperate panic, but Ian bodily blocked him, shoving him back against the easels. The architectural renderings crashed to the floor, the heavy cardboard shattering the illusion of his empire. The lawsuit my brother filed against me, I continued, my voice rising over the commotion, is a fraudulent, desperate cover-up. He procured a backdated medical affidavit from a corrupt doctor to temporarily freeze my personal assets, hoping to starve me out before I could expose his financial ruin. But he fundamentally miscalculated my strength. I pointed directly at my father, who was now standing frozen at the edge of the stage, his eyes wide with rising terror. And the family legacy they keep boasting about, I added, that is the biggest lie of all. In order to keep Cameron's fraudulent shell game afloat, my father secretly drained his entire corporate retirement portfolio. Worse, he illegally forged my mother's signature to take out 3 massive fraudulent secondary mortgages on their primary estate. Their home is currently racing toward foreclosure. The great Blackwell family empire is completely entirely bankrupt. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and violently total. The wealthy socialites, the prominent city officials, and the foreign investors stared at my family in profound, horrified disbelief. The pristine facade had been stripped away completely, revealing the rotting foundation beneath. The lead investor flipped open the dossier I had handed him. He scanned the first page, the executive summary of Cameron's debt to Vanguard Apex Solutions. He flipped to the next page, viewing the documentation of Howard's forged mortgages. He closed the folder with a sharp, definitive snap. He looked at Cameron, his expression hardening into pure, cold fury. "You lied to my face," he stated, his voice slicing through the silent room. "You attempted to defraud my syndicate out of $30 million using your sister's stolen inheritance as collateral." "It is a lie!" Cameron screamed, spittle flying from his lips. He was hyperventilating, backing away from the investors. "She is setting me up. She forged those documents. Dad, tell them she is lying." Howard did not speak. The patriarch, the man who had controlled every narrative and dictated every rule, simply stared at the floor. The crushing realization that his entire world was collapsing had finally paralyzed him. He had nothing left to say. His secrets were out, and his destruction was completely absolute. Diane let out a sharp, hysterical wail. She collapsed into her chair, burying her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as the surrounding high society guests physically backed away from her, treating her like a pariah. She was watching her country club memberships, her luxury vacations, and her pristine reputation evaporate in real time. The lead investor turned his back on Cameron. "We are leaving," he commanded his syndicate, "and we will be contacting the federal authorities immediately regarding this attempted wire fraud. Do not ever attempt to contact me again." The investors turned in unison and marched toward the exit doors, the sound of their footsteps echoing loudly in the massive, quiet ballroom. Cameron watched them go, his chest heaving, his eyes wild and completely broken. He had lost everything. His investors were gone. His creditors were circling. His father was ruined. He turned his manic, desperate gaze toward me. "You ruined me," he screamed, launching himself toward the edge of the stage, his face contorted in absolute agony. "You ruined my life, Fiona. You destroyed everything." I looked down at the brother who had mocked me, belittled me, and tried to steal my future. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I raised the microphone one final time. "I did not ruin you, Cameron," I said, my voice echoing cleanly through the massive, empty ballroom. "You threw your salvation into the fireplace. I just let it burn." I lowered the microphone and set it carefully on the edge of the stage. The feedback whined for a brief second before dying out, leaving the massive ballroom in a heavy, ringing silence. Cameron sank to his knees on the thick, patterned carpet, his hands clutching his head as the reality of his total destruction finally crushed the last remaining breath from his lungs. I did not look back at him. I did not look at my father, who was staring blankly at the shattered pieces of his fabricated empire. I did not look at my mother, who was still sobbing into her hands, realizing that her precious social status had just evaporated into thin air. I turned my back on all of them. I walked down the stage steps and took Ian's outstretched hand. His grip was warm and grounding, anchoring me to the reality I had built for myself. Bradley and Donovan fell into step beside us, forming an impenetrable wall of legal and personal protection. We walked out of the Grand Plaza Hotel through the same side doors we had entered, leaving the toxic remnants of the Blackwell family behind us forever. The cool night air hit my face as we stepped out onto the Chicago streets, and for the first time in 33 years, I took a breath that felt entirely, completely free. Fast forward exactly 1 year. The fallout from the investor gala was as swift as it was absolutely devastating for my family. The ridiculous injunction Cameron had filed against me was instantly dismissed with prejudice by the Cook County judge. Bradley presented the overwhelming evidence of the forged medical affidavit, and the judge threatened to have Dr. Thorne stripped of his medical license. My personal bank accounts were permanently unfrozen, and Vanguard Apex Solutions remained firmly under my absolute control. Cameron did not just lose his business, he lost his freedom. The moment the foreign investors walked out of the ballroom, they immediately contacted federal authorities. The FBI launched a massive criminal investigation into his real estate firm, uncovering years of systemic wire fraud and investor deception. Because I had authorized Donovan to hand over the complete forensic audit, Cameron had absolutely no defense.
His shell companies were dismantled, his assets were seized, and he is currently awaiting trial on multiple federal fraud charges. He faces decades in prison. The golden boy who could do no wrong is now relying on a public defender because he cannot afford a real attorney. My parents suffered a fate they considered to be worse than death itself. They lost their money and their social standing. When the bank discovered that my father had forged my mother's signature to take out secret secondary mortgages on the family estate, they immediately initiated foreclosure proceedings. Howard and Diane were forcibly evicted from the sprawling brick mansion where they had spent decades looking down on everyone else. Their luxury vehicles were repossessed. Their country club memberships were revoked. They were forced to downsize drastically, moving into a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a bleak industrial suburb far away from the elite circles they once ruled. Diane no longer hosts lavish dinner parties or complains about the quality of her espresso. She spends her days trapped in a tiny living room with a man who secretly gambled away their entire life savings. Howard is currently under investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission for draining his corporate retirement accounts to fund a criminal enterprise. They are completely isolated, cut off from the wealthy friends who abandoned them the second the scandal hit the local news. They tried to contact me, of course. In the first few months after the gala, my phone was bombarded with voicemails from my mother begging for forgiveness, pleading for a small loan just to help them get back on their feet. She claimed that family should always stick together during hard times. My father sent emails demanding that I release the funds from Vanguard Apex Solutions, insisting that I owed him for raising me. I did not respond to a single message. I simply forwarded everything to Bradley, who issued a strict cease and desist order, blocking them from ever contacting me again. I changed my phone number, I upgraded the security at my building, and I permanently severed the rotting branch of my family tree. With the toxic weight of my past finally lifted, I turned my attention to the future. I had $6 million in cleared liquid cash sitting in my private wealth account, and I knew exactly how I wanted to deploy it. I did not want to hoard it or use it to buy meaningless luxury items. I wanted to build something that would outlast me, something that would empower others who had been pushed down and underestimated. I used the inheritance to found a thriving technology incubator in downtown Chicago, specifically designed to fund and support female software developers and user experience designers. I named the incubator Beatrice Labs in honor of the fierce, brilliant woman who had given me the keys to my freedom. We provide seed capital mentorship and state-of-the-art workspace for women who are trying to break into the fiercely competitive tech industry. We help them build their portfolios, launch their applications, and secure patents for their original designs. Walking through the bright open concept floors of Beatrice Labs is the most rewarding experience of my professional life. Every day, I am surrounded by brilliant, driven women who are coding, designing, and creating their own independent wealth. I watch them pitch their ideas to angel investors with absolute, unwavering confidence. I make sure they know their value. I make sure they never have to shrink themselves to fit into a room dominated by arrogant men. I am giving them the exact same opportunity my grandmother gave to me, the opportunity to build a life on their own terms. My personal life has blossomed into something incredibly beautiful. Ian and I were married in a quiet, intimate ceremony overlooking Lake Michigan. We did not invite hundreds of wealthy strangers or politicians. We only invited the people who had stood by us when the fire was burning the hottest. Bradley was there raising a glass of vintage champagne to my grandmother's memory. Donovan attended celebrating the successful dismantling of a fraudulent empire. Professor Howard, my old college mentor, gave a beautiful speech about resilience and the undeniable power of authentic talent. Ian and I bought a stunning modern home in a quiet neighborhood surrounded by massive oak trees and peaceful walking trails. The house is filled with light, warmth, and absolute unconditional support. We do not play psychological games. We do not demand sacrifices to prove our loyalty. We simply love each other, building a partnership based on deep mutual respect and shared ambitions. Sometimes I sit on my back patio drinking my morning coffee and I think about that Christmas dinner. I think about the heavy mahogany table, the smell of roasted prime rib, and the suffocating tension that used to dictate my entire existence. I think about the moment my father and my brother held their salvation in their hands and arrogantly threw it into the flames. They thought they were destroying a meaningless piece of paper. They had no idea they were incinerating their own future. My family believed that wealth and power gave them the right to treat people like disposable props. They believed they could crush my spirit, steal my joy, and demand my total submission. They drastically underestimated the quiet girl sitting at the end of the table. They never realized that surviving their abuse had not made me weak. It had forged me into something completely unbreakable. I am 34 years old now. I run a massive technology incubator. I hold the controlling interest in a powerful real estate holding company. I am happily married to a man who respects my strength. I am living a wealthy, beautiful life built entirely on absolute ironclad boundaries and undeniable self-worth. I do not carry an ounce of guilt for leaving my parents and my brother behind. I do not lose sleep wondering how they are managing in their cramped apartment or what Cameron is telling his public defender. I gave them nothing because they deserved nothing. I let their empire of lies collapse under its own toxic weight. My grandmother Beatrice knew exactly what she was doing. She used her final days to administer a brutal, brilliant test of character. She rewarded respect, and she severely punished arrogance. She handed me the tools to build a fortress, and I used them to create a kingdom. I am no longer the invisible scapegoat. I am the architect of my own destiny, and my foundation is built on absolute unyielding truth. Looking back at the ashes in my parents' fireplace, I learned the most profound lesson of my life. Your worth is never defined by those who are committed to misunderstanding you. For 33 years, I allowed my family to shrink me. I accepted their narrative that I was the invisible scapegoat, the disappointing daughter, while they propped up a fragile illusion of superiority. But true power does not come from arrogant boasting or maintaining a wealthy country club facade. It comes from quiet resilience, honest work, and unwavering integrity. My grandmother Beatrice understood this perfectly. She knew that greed ultimately blinds people to their own salvation. When my father and brother arrogantly tore up those checks, they did not just burn their money, they incinerated their masks, revealing the rotting core of their entitlement. They taught me that family is not an unconditional free pass for abuse. Sharing DNA does not entitle anyone to your peace, your mental health, or your hard-earned success. The greatest inheritance I received was not the $24 million or the controlling shares of a massive holding company. It was the absolute realization that I am the architect of my own destiny. You do not need to fight a toxic system on its own terms. Sometimes you just need to set an ironclad boundary, step back, and let their own spectacular hubris dismantle their empire of lies. I built my beautiful new reality on truth, and I left them to live in the ashes they created. Share your experiences in the comments below about a time you had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your peace and sanity. Let me know how you found the courage to build your own life from scratch. If my journey to financial and emotional independence resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about setting boundaries, reclaiming your power, and living unapologetically. Remember, your worth is in your own hands. Never let anyone convince you to throw it into the fire.